500 years ago, an unprecedented meteor shower pierced space, causing the appearance of a huge black hole. From its sinister depths, like streams of falling stars, countless monsters gushed out. Dubbed evil spirits by humanity, these creatures that fed on human flesh possessed incredible strength that was many times greater than that of ordinary people. Humanity had neither a chance nor weapons to fight back against this scourge. The surviving people, having joined forces, were forced to create many safe zones. It was after some time, scientists discovered that a special substance could be extracted from the bodies of evil spirits. It was injected into animals, causing mutations that made them much stronger. It was soon discovered that people with strong spiritual power could form contracts with these mutated creatures, turning them into spirit pets. People who were able to tame spirits and fight with them became known as spirit masters. They became a symbol of hope, protectors who were valued and revered everywhere. However, this story begins with a tragic moment. A huge green wolf mauled a husky named 205 to death. His owner, a blue-haired boy named Christopher, desperately called for his pet. Christopher was pinned to the ground with his head stepped on. With the last of his strength, he begged Jason, the wolf's owner, to stop his beast and spare 205. A purple-haired boy named Jason, standing next to him, coldly reminded Christopher that there were people in life that were not worth going against. He said he killed Christopher's dog because it was causing him trouble, but added that if Christopher dared to harm him again, he would lose his life too. As Christopher tried to reach his lifeless pet, Jason pressed his face into the ground even harder. Despite this, Christopher's eyes were burning with rage. He looked straight at Jason and swore to kill him. Jason laughed loudly, asking how Christopher intended to carry out his threat. He said that if he wanted, he could end it right now. All he had to do was wish it. Suddenly, the wolf stopped mauling the husky and slowly turned towards Christopher. Christopher, overcome with horror, could only watch as the growling beast's jaws approached him. The tense situation was suddenly interrupted by a voice coming from the side, forcing the hooligans to stop. Turning around, the three men saw a girl with long hair in front of them. Her name was Linda. She said that they had already killed Christopher's pet and beat him badly, which meant it was time to stop. Linda reminded that, despite everything that had happened, Christopher was still her younger brother by last name, and she did not want his problems to affect her life. Jason, having perked up a little, grinned and said that for Linda's sake he was ready to let go of such an insignificant person. Once the bullies were out of sight, Linda turned to Christopher and asked why he continued to act as if he was looking for more trouble. She reminded him that in their society, a man of his position could not hope to defeat the Spirit Lord. Meanwhile, Christopher was hugging the lifeless body of his pet. Linda silently watched this heartbreaking scene, unable to find words to comfort him. After a while, she carefully said that 205 was just an ordinary dog, and Christopher shouldn't be so upset about losing him. However, he cut her off abruptly, stating that Linda, as a Spirit Lord, was incapable of understanding his feelings and should not try to comfort him. With tears in his eyes, he firmly promised that one day he would become a spiritual mentor, capable of surpassing not only Jason, but everyone else as well. When Linda left, leaving him alone, Christopher, with a heavy heart, began to dig a grave for his pet with his bare hands. The ground was hard, but he dug stubbornly, ignoring the blood streaming from his palms. When he finished, he gently laid the body of his faithful friend in the grave, saying goodbye to him forever, with a trembling voice. Christopher said that now the pet can find peace in the eternal world, where there is no more pain and suffering. But suddenly the silence was broken by something inexplicable. The space around was filled with strange glowing symbols, similar to elements of the binary system. A pillar of light appeared above the ground, surrounded by massive rings that resembled barcodes. And from the very center of this glow, a magical robotic entity resembling a cat appeared. She introduced herself as a spirit pet creation simulator. The system explained that Christopher's blood activated it. She offered him a unique opportunity to independently model and create spirit pets using a variety of collected materials. As a greeting, the system handed him a mysterious treasure chest, inviting him to open it. Christopher was overcome with curiosity and agreed. To his surprise, inside the chest were the rarest items, including hellfire, a 5-star material with the power to burn souls. He also found a drop of the blood of an ancient god, and in addition, there were mysterious spirits. Christopher scratched his head in confusion, trying to comprehend the unexpected discovery. To clarify the situation, he turned to the Soul Pet Creation Simulator and asked if he could save 205. The simulator's answer was affirmative. Moreover, it explained that a drop of the ancient god's blood possesses colossal power, capable of significantly increasing the chances of a successful revival of a pet. Inspired, Christopher agreed to the experiment. As soon as the process began, the system recommended enhancing the characteristics of the future pet, adding a mass of blue light and unearthly fire. This demonic pet had 5-star growth potential and was rated at F5. When the simulator announced the completion of the process, it informed Christopher that in honor of his first experience creating a pet, he was given a unique privilege, a +1 bonus to all skills. Moreover, he was given the opportunity to combine 2 of his pet's skills. Christopher was stunned by this news. After some thought, he decided to combine the skills Hellfire and Concussion. The simulator explained that the Concussion skill allowed one to neutralize opponents 2 levels higher, sharply reducing their combat potential, while Hellfire caused a flame that dealt both physical and mental damage. After combining the skills, Christopher felt a pulsating aura of blue flames begin to emanate from his body. He was convinced that he could now defeat even an elite F rank. A moment later, the simulator reminded Christopher that he needed to sign a contract with his spirit pet to complete the process. Suddenly he was overcome with doubts as painful memories from his childhood came flooding back. He was only 5 years old when a tragic incident damaged his spiritual strength. Throughout his life, people mocked him, considered him useless. The simulator, as if sensing Christopher's inner turmoil, confidently assured him that the system guaranteed 100% success in concluding contracts. Inspired by this support, Christopher approached 205, bit his finger and signed the contract in blood. After that, he touched his pet with his bloody finger. At that moment, the space was filled with a blinding light emanating from the magical pillar created by the conclusion of the contract. The contract was successfully concluded, and the simulator congratulated Christopher on this significant event. Now he could hear and understand the thoughts and words of his pet. When 205 first called him Master, joy filled Christopher's heart. He hugged 205 tightly, unable to contain his happiness. Later, Christopher asked the simulator an important question about whether 205 would be able to return to his previous appearance as a regular husky. He explained that although his pet's new majestic incarnation was impressive, it could be intimidating to those around him. 205, without hesitation, fulfilled his request. The wind swirled, enveloping the pet in smoke, and when everything cleared, the Cerberus once again took the form of a cute husky. Christopher, beaming with joy, noted to himself that in this form, the 205th would be able to deceive even the most experienced opponents. A wolf in sheep's clothing had become his secret weapon. At that moment, he gave himself his word that no one would dare to underestimate them again. Meanwhile, late at night, a loud scream was heard inside the main character's house. It was Christopher's stepmother, indignant at his late return home. She demanded that he explain where he had been and why his clothes were in such a dirty state. Christopher did not make excuses. He just stood silently, not reacting to her screams. But Christopher's patience was running out. At some point, he broke free from his stepmother's grip. In her fury, she continued to threaten, declaring that she would not hesitate to throw him out of the house and leave him to his fate, making him an orphan once again. He was only 5 years old when an accident occurred that left him with profound mental trauma. After that, his parents disappeared, leaving him alone. He was soon sent to an orphanage where he spent a year of his life before being adopted by his current family. The new parents, despite the adoption of a law requiring care of adopted orphans until they reach 16 years of age, accepted it with obvious reluctance. After learning that Christopher's spiritual powers were damaged and he could not form a contract with the pet, they began to treat him as a burden. His life quickly turned into a series of abuse, humiliation, and punishment. But then he endured it in silence, seeing no other way out. Now, standing in front of his stepmother, Christopher realized that he no longer had to endure the bullying. Christopher was about to go further, but before he could do anything, Linda intervened, her calm voice sounding unexpectedly appropriate. Breaking him out of the shackles of rage, she called his name, bringing him back to his composure. Meanwhile, the stepmother continued to shout her accusations. Her anger did not subside. But the stepfather still decided to intervene to quell the conflict. He advised his wife to leave Christopher alone, reminding her that in a few months, the boy would turn 16, and then they would get rid of the need to take care of him. However, the woman began to complain that despite all the efforts spent on his upbringing for 10 years, Christopher showed no gratitude, and now he even dared to threaten her. And in the end, in a fit of anger, she shouted at him to get out of their house. Christopher was not displeased with his stepmother's words. On the contrary, he firmly stated that he no longer wanted to stay in this house. Before heading to his room to pack his things, he declared that he would be better off without them. As he stood at the threshold, ready to leave, the stepmother could not resist another mocking remark. She demanded that he hurry up and get out, adding that with his trash qualifications, he would not be able to achieve anything in life. The woman angrily shouted that without their support, he would wander the streets, doomed to a miserable existence. As Christopher walked out the door, he paused for a moment, looking into the distance. He quietly asked himself if life would really be that hard. But then he reminded himself that life shouldn't be about just surviving. He intended to not just exist, but to live better than others. Suddenly his thoughts were interrupted by a familiar voice calling his name. Turning around, he saw Linda. She approached him, trying to persuade him to come home and apologize to his mother. She even promised to convince his stepmother to let him stay. However, Christopher, firm in his decision, refused. He repeated that he did not see himself as guilty and did not intend to ask for forgiveness. Linda, seeing that he could not be persuaded, finally resigned herself to his decision. She took some money out of her pocket and handed it to him. She explained that this was the least she could do to help him. This gesture unexpectedly touched Christopher. He fell silent, thinking about his memories associated with Linda. She was always different from others. Even though she was only his half-sister, she never mocked him, nor did she join the others in ridiculing him for his inability to become a spirit master. Slightly embarrassed, he accepted the money, but said that he considered it a loan and would definitely return it in the future. Linda, smiling, said goodbye to him and wished him to be careful. Later, Christopher found a place to live, moving into a modest apartment building. The owner of the house showed him his room and explained that the rent would cost $2,000 a month. Christopher learned that he would be sharing an apartment with a neighbor. The owner described her as a very beautiful, but at the same time mysterious girl. But he warned that her character left much to be desired and advised her to be careful. He especially emphasized that Christopher should not enter her room at night, as this could end badly for him. Christopher found such warnings suspicious, as if the owner had already tried to do something similar. The next day was a bright sunny morning, and everything was going on as usual at school. Jason sat in the corner of the classroom, watching Christopher with a smirk as he walked in. Jason commented out loud that it had only been one night, and his wounds had already healed. He then switched to the topic of 205, mocking Christopher for coming to school without his spirit pet. Christopher, without showing the slightest sign of fear or doubt, calmly but firmly explained to Jason that he himself was going to find him. But, as it turned out, fate brought Jason to him. Suddenly the boy noticed that Christopher seemed taller and more impressive than usual. Jason couldn't understand whether Christopher had changed overnight, or he had simply not paid attention to it before. In an effort to maintain his appearance of superiority, Jason attempted to make Christopher bow his head so as not to look down on him. However, Christopher, without wasting a second, intercepted his hand. With a deft and quick movement, he twisted it, forcing Jason to kneel right on the floor. Shock and bewilderment filled Jason's face. He had not expected Christopher to resist at all, and with such force. Christopher, remaining cool, abruptly stated that it was time for Jason to experience what it was like to be hit back. With that, he used his suddenly awakened power to break Jason's arm, causing him to let out a loud cry of pain. However, Christopher didn't stop there. In a burst of strength, he delivered a crushing kick to Jason's chest, sending him flying across the entire classroom and landing in the opposite corner. This moment caused general horror. The students, who became involuntary witnesses of what was happening, froze in stupor. Then Christopher confidently declared that this was only the beginning of his retribution. He firmly promised that he would make Jason answer for all the insults and humiliations. Meanwhile, Jason, who had come to his senses, was filled with rage. He declared that a man like Christopher would never dare raise a hand against him, and stated that Christopher should have died last time. To prove his point, Jason summoned his spirit pet, and a green portal suddenly appeared in the middle of the classroom. From it, with a growl, emerged the Ironback Wolf, a fearsome 1.5-star F3 level battle pet. However, even this creature had its weaknesses. Its stomach was its most vulnerable spot, and it was powerless against flying and ghostly pets. Meanwhile, the protagonists tried to compare their strengths and think whether 205 could defeat him. Jason, regardless of the possible consequences, commanded the wolf to tear Christopher apart. The wolf, letting out a threatening growl, rushed towards Christopher like the embodiment of bloodlust. But Christopher, without flinching for a moment, activated his new power. Mystical lights suddenly flared in his eyes, turning them into black spheres with a golden halo. An invisible but incredibly powerful energy emanating from his gaze stopped the iron-backed wolf in midair like a wall. The immobilized creature hung helplessly, unable to get closer. Realizing that the decisive moment had come, Christopher began to prepare his finishing blow. Not giving the beast a chance to react, he delivered a powerful kick straight to the stomach, the most vulnerable part of its body. The force of the blow was so great that the wolf was thrown across the entire classroom. He crashed into Jason, and both of them hit the wall with a deafening thud. The students who witnessed this scene froze in mute amazement. Some thought they were seeing a dream. What was happening seemed so incredible, their minds could not comprehend that Christopher, who until recently had been the object of ridicule, was capable of such a thing. Meanwhile, Jason and his spirit pet struggled to their feet, their anger at Christopher only growing. However, Christopher, not paying attention to their condition, sarcastically asked what was stopping them from attacking him again if they considered themselves so strong. At that moment, a girl with bright pink hair stepped forward from the crowd, Sabrina. She demanded that Jason stop immediately, reminding him that summoning spirit beasts inside the classroom was strictly prohibited by school rules. Jason, clearly annoyed, snapped at Sabrina, telling her not to interfere in things that didn't concern her. However, Sabrina seemed adamant. Despite this, Jason ignored her words. He ordered his ironback wolf to prepare for another attack. Sabrina, tired of his stupid stubbornness, lost her patience. She took the last step forward, and her voice sounded with an unusually cold determination. Repeating her warning, she called upon her pet. This fire-type pet had a 4-star rating and a level of F9, and its flame strike ability had long been renowned for its destructive power, though it remained vulnerable to water and rock-type pets. Even Christopher, observing this magnificent creature, could not help but notice its strength. He was impressed not only by its elegance, but also by the potential that was hidden behind this formidable appearance. When the tension in the class became almost palpable, their teacher intervened in the situation, sternly demanding an explanation. She demanded to know immediately what was going on. Sabrina, Christopher, and Jason, noticing her approach, involuntarily became worried. Immediately, without a second's delay, she reminded them that summoning spirit pets in the classroom was strictly prohibited. Turning her attention to Sabrina, the teacher noted that as the head girl, she should have known all the rules well. Then, with grim seriousness, she asked her what she would do if one of their classmates were to get hurt because of her actions. Sabrina, feeling somewhat guilty, explained that Jason had called his pet first, and that she had only tried to warn him of the consequences. However, she had barely finished her explanation when the teacher, visibly angry with the situation, could not stand it any longer and loudly slammed her pointer on the table. The teacher, without wasting any time, ordered Jason to immediately release his pet and go to the infirmary for examination. Jason obeyed the order without question. He told his wolf to go back. Sabrina, seeing that the situation had stabilized, released her spirit pet, Ho-Ho. As Jason passed Christopher, holding back his anger, he muttered angrily that he would never forget what happened to him. To which Christopher, looking calmly at him, coldly remarked that, in turn, he would not forget this. He even added that Jason's wrist injury was just the beginning, and he would definitely make him pay for everything he did. The teacher, who was watching the whole thing, could hardly believe that Christopher, who was once considered a weakling, had managed to defeat Ironback Wolf with only his physical strength. It was incredible, especially considering his previous reputation. Sometime later, Christopher and Sabrina were running across the school sports field, taking punishment for their actions. While running, Christopher, trying to explain his position, said that she should not have been punished, as the fight between him and Jason was purely a personal matter. Sabrina, however, said that while she shouldn't have gotten involved, she couldn't just stand by and watch Jason bully him, especially since her friends wouldn't be able to stay away. As it turned out, the teacher did give Sabrina a punishment, 5 laps around the school field. Although Jason was primarily to blame, the teacher believed that Sabrina was also responsible for summoning her pet, which could harm her classmates. At this time, Christopher, not wanting to remain on the sidelines of punishment, approached the teacher and insisted that he too be punished for his participation in this incident. He believed that responsibility for what happened lay with him. The teacher, impressed by his determination and mature approach to the situation, agreed to his request. Back in the present, Christopher explained to Sabrina that as a man he couldn't let a girl defend him. In response, he bragged about how he brutally beat Jason half to death. Sabrina acknowledged his strength and respectfully noted that he was truly amazing. As it turned out, she and Christopher had known each other since they were children in an orphanage. Thanks to her outstanding spiritual strength, Sabrina became a child prodigy and was soon adopted by the vice president of the Jianan Royal Management Association. With access to vast resources, she became one of the most powerful spirit masters of her generation. Suddenly, Sabrina stopped and looked thoughtfully at Christopher. She asked if it was true that Jason had killed his spirit pet, 205, that morning. She explained that Jason had been tormenting him all this time because of her. The thing is, he was jealous of their relationship and couldn't forgive her for rejecting his confession. Tears quickly welled up in her eyes. She admitted that she never thought that Jason was actually capable of killing 205, Christopher's only faithful companion. Hearing her words, Christopher, with a feeling of tenderness, gently stroked her head. He calmed the girl down, assuring her that she was in no way guilty. He emphasized that Jason was the only one to blame for this whole situation, and this admission brought Sabrina long-awaited relief. Smiling slightly, Christopher reported that 205 fortunately did not die. He opened a portal in front of her and invited her to see for herself. Sabrina's eyes widened in surprise and then filled with delight as she saw 205 emerge from the portal. The creature immediately jumped on her, and she hugged him tightly, not hiding her joy that he was alive. Meanwhile, 205, expressing his affection, began to rub his muzzle against Sabrina. Suddenly Sabrina realized something. Turning to Christopher, she blushed slightly, asking with concern how exactly 205 ended up in this world through the contract gate. Before Christopher could respond, her gaze grew more and more confident, and she guessed that he had probably made a contract with 205, making him his spirit master. Christopher, watching her, was surprised to admit that her assumption was correct, and explained that he had managed to obtain several unique artifacts that not only healed 205, but also restored his lost spiritual powers. In the distance, Jason watched what was happening, becoming more and more filled with jealousy and hatred with each passing moment. He silently swore to himself that he would take revenge and kill Christopher for daring to humiliate him so cruelly. That same evening, Christopher returned home to his apartment. As he approached the door, he immediately noticed that it was not locked, which seemed a little strange to him. Listening closely, he heard someone taking a shower in the bathroom, and remembered that the owner of the apartment had mentioned his neighbor. This made him uneasy, and he began to look forward to what would happen next. When he finally entered the apartment, it turned out that his neighbor had just finished taking a bath and came out of the bathroom, completely naked. Christopher's eyes instantly widened at the unexpected scene. The stranger, noticing his confusion, quickly disappeared into the bathroom and closed the door tightly behind her. Christopher, standing in complete bewilderment, tried to comprehend what was happening. Thoughts flashed through his head, and he finally came to the conclusion that the owner of the house was right. His neighbor really was stunningly beautiful. A few moments later, the lady reappeared, and Christopher hastened to assure her that what had happened was completely unintentional, as he did not know that she was currently taking a shower. He also cautiously inquired whether this was the neighbor that the owner of the house had spoken of. However, he did not notice that she had a knife in her hand, and without saying a word she quickly rushed at him, which left Christopher in a state of shock. Luckily, his reflexes were fast enough, and he managed to dodge the blade that was aimed straight at his head. Christopher screamed at her in panic, asked what she was doing, and completely lost his composure. However, the girl, realizing that he had sudden agility and was able to dodge her attack, came to the conclusion that he was not as simple as it might seem at first glance. Christopher guessed that she would not stop at one attempt, and prepared for the next attack, preparing to dodge her blows. When she tried to attack again, he, still dodging, tried to calm her down, admitting that seeing her naked was indeed wrong, but at the same time emphasizing that it happened by accident and without malicious intent. Christopher managed to block her blow and parry several swings of the knife. Realizing that in order to talk and resolve the conflict, he first needed to disarm her, he quickly grabbed her hand with the knife. Then, not allowing her to escape, he took his other hand and raised both above her head, trying to achieve at least a moment of calm. At this point, the woman lost her balance and both ended up on the floor, falling. She probably realized that the situation was out of control. All Christopher could do was apologize for everything that happened. Once on the floor, he accidentally ended up on top of the girl. The situation was so uncomfortable that Christopher quickly tried to calm her down, repeating that he had never meant to harm her. He explained that he was a tenant in this house and suggested discussing what had happened in a calm environment. However, the girl, still furious and embarrassed, told him to leave her alone. Realizing what had happened, Christopher quickly got off her and, barely containing his embarrassment, apologized. When they both got to their feet, he firmly told her not to use the knife against him again. She nodded in agreement, but her eyes still showed her determination to continue her attempts at revenge. Wasting no time, she moved to Plan B and, moving quickly, kicked him in the groin. Sensing her intention, Christopher instantly activated his skill to immobilize her, barely managing to dodge her attack. Realizing how close he was to disaster, Christopher stepped back, fully aware that this lady was a real threat. When he asked her why she had broken her word, she replied that she had not used the knife this time, and therefore had kept to the agreement. Although she was right in one sense, her violent tendencies remained obvious. She suddenly became confused, realizing that her body was no longer under her control, and came to the conclusion that Christopher had the ability to influence her soul. In response, Christopher explained that he had only moved in yesterday and had heard from the owner of the apartment that she was a mysterious person, which explained his bewilderment about her behavior. He once again emphasized that he saw her naked by accident, but added that the situation was aggravated by her appearance from the bathroom without clothes. After listening to his explanation, she, obviously having thought about the situation, decided to let him go for today. However, she warned the guy that he should forget about everything that happened, threatening to kill him if he did not. Her fearless and hot-tempered character left no doubt that she was capable of serious actions. The main character realized that the owner of the house was right when he said that her character left much to be desired. The next day, Christopher headed to the mercenary city. It was a noisy and bustling area, filled with people who were getting money for the work they did. As a newcomer to the world of spirit masters, Christopher didn't know what he was about to do. Realizing he was missing the mercenary badge needed to receive missions, he turned to the lobby attendant for help. She patiently explained to him that by joining an officially registered mercenary group, he would automatically receive his badge. She then directed him to a recruiting ground located near the city gates, where groups were actively seeking new members. Having received all the answers he needed, Christopher thanked the clerk, who seemed happy to help him. The other visitors in the hall couldn't help but notice how polite and grateful he was. He said goodbye to the woman and headed towards the recruiting site. On the way, he met a tall, muscular man with an impressive figure. Christopher noticed how the other people in the hall were annoyed by his behavior, disrespectful to the line, but knowing his status, they chose to remain silent. This man was Caleb, a member of the Iron Blood mercenary group, which held the first place in the mercenary city. When Caleb approached the front desk, he mockingly addressed the clerk as a chick and demanded to know if there were any tasks for him. However, he immediately responded to her irritably that a simpleton like her had no right to tell him what to do. He continued, pointing out that he stood in front of all the other people in the queue, but none of them objected. Despite this, the employee, in desperation, continued to beg him to follow the rules and get in line. Her eyes, full of anxiety and hopelessness, only fueled Caleb's rage. He, of course, could not restrain himself, and preparing to cruelly punish her for disobedience, was already about to grab her by the hair. However, at this moment Christopher intervened. He quickly jumped up and grabbed Caleb by the arm, decisively stopping him. Caleb, surprised and aggressive, demanded to explain who this man was and why he dared to intervene. Christopher calmly and confidently stated that he was just an ordinary student who could not stand being bullied. Maintaining intense eye contact, he held Caleb's hand tightly, not allowing him to pull away. While they were standing face to face, everything that was happening attracted the attention of other people in the room. The crowd watched this confrontation with growing interest, and one of the passers-by, grinning, predicted that Christopher would certainly regret his decision to challenge Caleb. These comments caused Caleb to become nervous, realizing that his loss in the eyes of so many people would ruin his reputation. Trying to save face and not lose respect, he decided that the only way to avoid shame was to strike hard, declaring that Christopher would certainly pay for his interference. However, Christopher, anticipating Caleb's possible actions, remained focused and waited for the right moment. With perfect timing, he counterpunched, effectively knocking Caleb to the ground with a 360-degree maneuver. The spectators watching what was happening were stunned. No one could believe that a newcomer who ended up here by accident was able to defeat Caleb. He was known as the champion of the underground fighting arena in John City. Humiliated and furious, Caleb did not hesitate. Suddenly he summoned his famous pet spirit berserker, Black Bear. A dark brown portal flashed in the hall, and a huge bear jumped out of it. A 2-star E3 level battle pet, however. Despite its enormous strength, the bear also had weaknesses. Its vulnerable spot was its nose. Caleb, confidently controlling his pet, whom he called Sean, gave the order to attack Christopher. Watching the Black Bear berserker use his power, Christopher knew he was in for a tough test. The bear used the skill Impact Roar, and this attack shocked not only Christopher himself, but also all the weak passers-by in the hall. The incredibly loud scream made people cover their ears with their hands. However, despite the full force of the attack, Christopher remained unharmed, leaving Caleb confused. He couldn't understand how Christopher was able to resist such a powerful bear skill, while everyone else was in a state of stupor. Looking calmly at Caleb, Christopher replied that if he wanted to continue, he would be happy to join in this gameplay. Caleb, increasingly overcome with excitement, prepared for an even more aggressive attack, confident of his victory. Meanwhile, Christopher summoned his own spirit pet. His beast emerged from a large purple portal, and the crowd waited eagerly to see what creature would emerge this time. However, when the husky came out, the excited anticipation quickly turned to laughter. Some spectators began to scoff, questioning Christopher's choice, and joking that the husky might flee the arena if it couldn't withstand the fight. One woman in the crowd even noted with a smile that the husky seemed to be looking right at her. Caleb, seeing his pet, also laughed and said that he simply overestimated this guy. He then ordered Sean to attack the husky and eat him for dinner. Then the hero drew his pet's attention to the fact that everyone was laughing at them. Despite all the ridicule, Christopher was determined to tell his husky, 205, to prove his strength. As the black bear used its powerful iron claw skill to attack, 205 deftly dodged it, showing off his incredible agility and skill. Caleb chuckled and laughed at the husky's attempt to counterattack, calling it suicide. However, his laughter was quickly cut short when 205, to the amazement of the audience, transformed into a majestic Cerberus. Caleb watched in wide-eyed amazement as the creature prepared for the final blow. The berserker, noticing the threat, retreated, trying to avoid a direct confrontation. But the 205th, not missing the moment, used his shock skill to turn the bear into stone and make it vulnerable. Taking advantage of this, Cerberus delivered a powerful blow to the bear's left eye. Although the bear survived, the damage was quite severe. Both spirit beasts retreated temporarily, giving each other time to assess the situation and prepare for the next stage of the battle. Realizing that the fight was becoming increasingly intense, Caleb acknowledged Christopher's skill. But despite everything, he ordered his bear to continue the fight. He ordered Sean to use the brutal strike skill, vowing to destroy 205 and restore his lost pride. In response, Christopher commanded 205 to use the powerful skill Unearthly Fire against the enemy. Bright tongues of flame engulfed the bear, blazing intensely and causing serious damage to it. But Sean, despite all the force of the attack, was able to parry the blow by using his brutal strike, which allowed him to withstand the attack with great force. Suddenly, under the influence of pain and anger, Sean went into a berserker state. Realizing what was happening, Christopher hastened to warn his pet that he needed to be extremely careful. However, the black bear Berser, unable to restrain himself, launched a series of swift and powerful blows. 205th, he was knocked down and fell to the floor in critical condition. Seeing his pet so badly injured, Christopher felt a surge of guilt and self-condemnation. He blamed himself for the fact that his inexperience as a commander led to such dire consequences. He thought that perhaps if he hadn't insisted on a frontal attack against such a powerful soul pet, things might have ended differently. If he had waited for the right moment to counterattack and used the strike skill to avoid the bear's attacks, the outcome of the battle might have been more successful. Christopher also admitted that the black bear had truly earned its reputation among the E-class spirit pets. Being able to withstand the ethereal fire and repel a blow with such destructive force, the bear had proven its strength and resilience. However, despite his power, Christopher couldn't help but notice that the bear seemed increasingly out of focus. After confirming that both fighters were seriously injured, Christopher apologized to 205 for his mistakes, admitting that he should have been more careful and cautious. He then ordered his pet to return to the contract gate so that he could recover. However, to his surprise, 205 opposed this decision, making it clear that he did not want to leave his master in such a dangerous situation. Christopher then assured him that he had a plan and that everything would be fine, promising to deal with the problem. Hearing his master's words, 205 felt relieved, and before disappearing into the contract gate, urged him to be careful. Meanwhile, Caleb, watching what was happening, could not help but mock. He called Christopher an idiot for sending away his spirit pet at the most decisive moment of the battle. Caleb mockingly stated that Christopher apparently wasn't averse to facing his own death, and the protagonist responded by asking if he would force his pet to continue fighting if he was seriously wounded. When Caleb made it clear that he would not hesitate, Christopher emphasized that anyone who did not care for their pet could not be called a true spirit master. However, despite these words, Caleb considered Christopher's point of view to be naive and childish. Caleb explained that in his experience, spirit guides often carry out the most dangerous missions, where there is no room for caring for pets. Suddenly, the black bear leapt towards Christopher, ready to deliver the killing blow. However, at the very last moment, a mysterious guy appeared, accompanied by several bodyguards who stopped the fight. The stranger questioned Caleb, asking if he knew about the rules that were in effect in the mercenary city. He reminded both fighters that regardless of personal grievances, fighting within the city was strictly prohibited, and such actions would be severely punished. The crowd gradually began to realize who was standing in front of them, and once in the spotlight, the man revealed his identity. It was the city's young master. The hall was filled with a murmur of surprise, and many began to speculate that he might have come to confront the group of mercenaries, while others noted that they were insignificant compared to the authority of the young master. As Christopher looked at the young master with obvious curiosity, he quickly noticed that he was also the son of an influential city lord, which further raised his importance in the eyes of those around him. As the young master approached, Caleb admitted that he was aware of the rules in force in this city. He, in turn, asked whether these rules applied to a person like himself, and immediately declared that Christopher had insulted him and deserved punishment. Caleb hoped that given his connections to the Ironblood mercenary group, the young master would be lenient and not interfere in this conflict. However, the young master, remaining calm and unperturbed, responded with a rhetorical question, asking why he should make an exception for Caleb. He added that, to his knowledge, Caleb had no authority to speak on behalf of the Ironblood mercenaries, which cast doubt on his claim to special treatment. Stunned, Caleb held back his anger and reluctantly agreed to retreat. He promised to keep Christopher alive, but warned him not to show up in the mercenary city again. Otherwise, the consequences could be dire. He then ordered his pet, Sean, to return to the contract gate. After this, the young master turned to Christopher, asking if he was safe. Introducing himself as Martin, he thanked Christopher for protecting one of his employees. Christopher, in turn, introduced himself and thanked Martin for his intervention, which prevented further violence and diffused the situation. Martin, still calm, gave Christopher some helpful advice. He noted that while Caleb's character does leave much to be desired, his black bear certainly has tremendous strength. Martin then praised Christopher for being able to wound such a formidable spirit pet, but also warned that Caleb would most likely not forgive this and would seek revenge. In response, Christopher thanked him for the advice. After some time, Christopher reached the recruiting ground in Mercenary City. There, many mercenaries discussed with new applicants their possible participation in various groups. Suddenly, Christopher noticed several more unusual groups, such as Teacher Ma, who was looking for spirit masters who knew martial arts. There was also a group called the Super Salty Candies, which attracted fair-skinned brothers who could dance. For some time, Christopher considered which group would be best to join. Suddenly, she sat nearby and watched everything that was happening with no interest. After a few seconds of observation, he was surprised to recognize her as his roommate. He noted that after changing clothes, she looked almost unrecognizable. Christopher, noticing that fate seemed to have brought him together with this woman again, decided to approach her. She met his gaze, and he couldn't help but glance over her figure. Immediately standing up, she demanded with a cold expression to know why he had come. Before Christopher could answer, the woman grabbed him by the collar and, looking him in the eye, warned him to immediately forget about what had happened last night. Otherwise, he would face dire consequences. Christopher wanted to apologize, but everything became clear when he realized that she was not going to listen to him. He felt disappointed to realize that her stubbornness knew no bounds. At that moment, as if by magic, a man appeared out of nowhere and asked the woman if Christopher was her friend. The woman, without thinking, immediately denied it. But the man, not paying attention to her words, asked Christopher if he would like to join a group of mercenaries called the Carefree. Introducing himself as Mateo, he revealed that the woman was his daughter, Gwen, and although Christopher already suspected that they might have known each other, he did not immediately comment on the situation. However, Gwen once again firmly stated that she did not know Christopher. After a lengthy monologue, Mateo, apparently deciding it was time to get down to business, asked Christopher to introduce himself. The chief said his name and joy appeared on Mateo's face. He noted that they had the same last name and concluded that they were possibly related. However, Christopher, with a smile, rejected this assumption. Mateo, not wanting to give in, insisted that they were one and the same. Suddenly Mateo, without warning, asked him when he was going to start work, which completely confused him. Then, without giving him time to think, Mateo insisted that Christopher sit down and, in an official tone, announced that the mercenary group, the Carefrees, were hiring him. Christopher was puzzled and immediately tried to explain that he had never agreed to join. To this, Mateo, without losing his composure, asked whether Christopher was looking for just such a group of mercenaries. Then Christopher, after a little hesitation, reluctantly agreed. Mateo, noticing his hesitation, asked another question, wondering if Christopher found his daughter attractive, to which the boy responded attractively. Mateo immediately used his answer as an excuse, insisting that the Carefree group was the best choice for Christopher. Moreover, he promised him special privileges, which further complicated the situation. However, Gwen, irritated by her father's antics, could not resist hitting him on the head. In response, Mateo just laughed and said that his daughter was just embarrassed. Seeing a large bump on his head, Christopher asked curiously if he was okay. However, the boy suddenly realized that he was wearing a badge that signified his official membership in the group. Mateo wasted no time in quickly slipping away to register Christopher's information. He explained that all he had to do to complete the process was write his name on the badge. Christopher, watching this rapid bustle, noted how everything happened quickly and in an organized manner. Mateo soon returned, grabbed Christopher by the hand, and announced that he would take him to headquarters. Before Christopher could even protest, he suddenly discovered that he was being led away. When they finally reached headquarters, Mateo greeted Christopher warmly. Looking around, the hero noticed that the room was completely empty. At that moment, Gwen entered the room. She explained that there were only 3 people in their group: she, her father, and now Christopher himself. As the reality of the situation sunk in, Christopher felt his head begin to ache with growing bewilderment. He could not understand how such a group could be considered a genuine mercenary organization, and felt deeply deceived. Doubts grew in his mind about their ability to carry out any tasks, because his goal was to find a stable job and earn a living. Then Mateo, trying to cheer Christopher up, stated that their group carefully selects its members. Despite their dubious origins, they managed to get missions. Then he offered Christopher to go on a 2-star mission with him. Excited by this prospect, Christopher looked forward to the challenge. However, Gwen unexpectedly refused to work with him, stating that she could handle the task on her own. She explained that the burden would be too tiring and insisted that she would have to protect him, which she thought was extremely troublesome. Mateo, observing her behavior, noticed that her bad upbringing made her who she was, and advised Christopher not to take her words too much to heart. Christopher, in turn, assured him that he had no intention of arguing with her, and added that he was even more interested in participating in the mission. He expressed a desire to see her exceptional abilities in action. Then Gwen finally allowed him to join, but on one condition: he should not call for help. She informed him that their car was ready, and they should leave immediately. As they began their mission, the girl explained that their goal was to find and destroy an E-class evil spirit that had been spotted on the national highway in the suburbs of the city. She noted that, being a ghost, this spirit could not be detected by ordinary instruments. Christopher listened attentively as she described how this spirit had caused numerous accidents that had resulted in significant loss of life and property. Concerned, the protagonist asked how they should deal with such a dangerous spirit. Suddenly his gaze was caught by a beautiful female figure floating nearby. Both Christopher and Gwen were mesmerized by her beauty, as if they had fallen under her hypnotic spell. To Christopher she seemed like a real fairy, incredibly alluring and mysterious. They continued to move forward, their car seemingly possessed by the spirits of the mysterious floating ladies. Gwen, still under the power of these spirits, and Christopher, who found himself in the very center of a dangerous situation, felt extremely uncomfortable. Suddenly, 205 began to howl, attracting their attention. Using the Spirit Pet Creation Simulator, 205 was able to contact her owner and bring Christopher back to reality. At that moment, Christopher realized with a stunned expression that they were about to hit a dead end. In a panic and desperate attempt to avoid disaster, he grabbed the steering wheel and managed to make a maneuver in time before the car crashed into the wall. Although they avoided the accident, panic did not leave Christopher. He continued to call Gwen by name, but she was still under the influence of the spirits. The situation was getting worse, and Christopher, seeing that he couldn't stop the car, realized that the reason was that Gwen kept pressing on the gas pedal. At that moment, a husky came to their aid. 205 suggested that Christopher shock her, which he promptly did. After that, Gwen returned to reality. At the same time, Christopher managed to safely stop the car, avoiding another collision with a dead end. However, despite being saved, Christopher did not take into account the inertia from the sudden stop. Suddenly he was thrown out of the car, crashing into the hard ground. Seeing him in this state, Gwen rushed to him to make sure he was okay. Although Christopher was clearly not in the best of health, he seemed to have recovered somewhat from the shock. Soon the main character, having gathered his courage, asked if she herself was okay. The blow left his head damaged, but he was still able to smile and praise Gwen for her kindness. However, the girl, not prone to deception, knew perfectly well what she was doing, and, deciding to act in the best possible way for a man with a head injury, she dropped him, allowing him to hit his head again. She then asked Christopher where they were, as it seemed like they were lost. Christopher explained that they were trapped in an illusion created by an evil spirit like a ghost. This explanation only increased Gwen's questions, and she asked curiously how he managed to get out of this illusion. At this time, 205 appeared and received many thanks for his great help. Coming out of the contract gate, 205 happily jumped on Gwen. He thought that the master had found this beauty for him. Knowing that the spirit pet was capable of many things, Christopher tried to stop it, but to no avail. As expected, 205 received a strong kick from Gwen, leaving a large lump on his face and sending him crashing to the hard ground. Christopher explained to the girl that 205 was a demon-type pet, making it ideal for fighting spirits. Knowing this, Gwen decided to leave 215 alive, although she noted to herself that this dog was clearly strange. However, after the blow, 205 was barely able to stand on his feet, and was still stunned by the force of the blow. The girl then focused on their task, reminding Christopher that they were running out of time. He instructed 205 to track down the scent of the evil spirit. 205 immediately turned on his enhanced olfactory abilities to find the spirit. After some time, thanks to his heightened sense of smell, 205 accurately determined the location of the spirit. When they arrived at their destination, 205's canine instincts kicked in immediately, and he began barking loudly, warning of the enemy's presence. Realizing that the threat was real, Christopher and Gwen prepared for possible attacks. Then the girl opened the treaty gate and released her pet spirit, which she named Blackie. Blackie, a swift thunder panther from the powerful lightning family, was not just a pet. She had an impressive growth rating of 2.5 stars, and possessed special skills such as Thunderclap and Heaven's Wrath. Gwen explained that their opponent was invisible, but Blackie or 205 were great opponents for ghost types. Therefore, the spirit will most likely not dare to attack them directly. Excited by what was happening, Christopher was ready to show everything he could do. However, instead of answering Gwen's questions right away, he told 205 to get ready. The next moment, 205 transformed, revealing his true form, which left Gwen in a state of awe. Just a second ago, he was in the form of an ordinary dog, but now he has turned into a powerful Cerberus. Unable to contain his curiosity, the hero asked if the 205th saw the enemy. 205 confirmed that he could see it, and Christopher then gave the order to use Fire Strike against the spirit. As soon as the 205th began their attack, an invisible enemy materialized in front of them. It was a malevolent spirit, the Ghost of Resentment from the Ghost family, who possessed two powerful skills, Dreamland and Aura of Discontent. He was particularly vulnerable to demon and enlightenment types, but the paths of his evolution remained unknown. After 205 detected the spirit's hidden presence, it let out a loud, piercing scream that caused Christopher and Gwen great pain. For the girl, this scream was unbearably unpleasant. Enraged by the painful sound, she couldn't help but order Blackie to attack the restless ghost with heavenly wrath. Soon, a dark purple lightning, as if writhing in the air, fell upon the enemy. She pierced the ghost's body with a powerful bolt of lightning. The attack was so powerful that the Ghost of Resentment's body disintegrated, and its evil spell ceased. However, despite the fact that the cries of the spirit had disappeared, the danger had not yet passed. Not understanding what was happening, the main character looked around. 205th warned Christopher, alerting him to the enemy approaching from behind. And as soon as Christopher turned around, to his surprise, he was faced with Gwen attacking him with a dagger. The main character did not have time to react in time, and the blade injured his shoulder. Christopher, not understanding what was happening, could not explain to himself why she was behaving so strangely. Suddenly, the hero noticed the frightening expression on the girl's face and her glowing red eyes. He soon realized that she was being influenced by the phantom's aura of resentment. It intensified her inner hatred and anger, which provoked her attack. Christopher realized that the touchy ghost had not been destroyed, and continued to manipulate them into fighting each other. Under the influence of the spirit, Gwen continued to strike with her fast and deadly blades. However, she was unstable and could not control her actions. Although the shock had helped bring her back to reality last time, Christopher was hesitant to use it again as it seemed too risky. So he had only two ways left to win the girl. The first option was to kill Gwen, and the second was to get rid of the evil spirit. After weighing the situation, he came to the conclusion that the best option would be to destroy the ghost before it could cause any more harm. Christopher then commanded his pet spirit 205 to find and destroy the evil spirit. 205 immediately obeyed and, having detected the spirit, used Fire Strike again. Thus, this exciting battle began to gain momentum. At the same time, the confused Chernish did not know how to behave, and only sat, watching what was happening. At that moment, the main character looked at the beast. Noticing her hesitation, Christopher quickly ordered Chernish to assist 205 in fighting the spirit, and she immediately sprang into action. Chernish and 205 combined their efforts to deliver a powerful blow. They used powerful attacks such as Heavenly Fire and Heaven's Wrath. Despite all the destructive power of their combined efforts, the evil spirit, alas, was still not destroyed. At that moment, the hero realized that his plan had failed. He couldn't believe that even such a coordinated attack didn't work. Then Christopher suddenly remembered that the spirit's soul was stored in the center of his forehead. Then, without delay, he gave the order to the 205th and Chernish to concentrate their attacks precisely on this vulnerable spot. However, unfortunately, due to the protagonist stopping paying attention to Gwen, he received a critical hit to the stomach. When Christopher hit the ground, she was on top of him, looking like she was about to point the knife straight at his heart. Unable to fend off this fatal blow, Christopher wondered about his fate. He couldn't believe that he would die at the hands of a girl. When death seemed inevitable, he remembered Caleb's words about the reality of the existence of the owner of a spiritual pet. Then he realized an important truth. There is nothing in this world that can guarantee complete safety. As the tip of the knife almost touched his throat, Christopher thought about how he wished he could live a little longer, if only to realize that his life would not end so quickly. At that moment, 205 and Chernish, working in a coordinated manner, struck at the spirit's most vulnerable spot, thereby putting an end to its miserable existence. This destruction of the evil power that the spirit had imposed on Gwen gave her a chance for salvation. A look of surprise appeared on the girl's face, and at the last moment she stuck the knife into the ground near the hero's head. Watching with relief as the scene unfolded, Christopher saw her return to reality and eventually pass out. The girl tried to bring the guy to his senses, but he had already passed out from the pain. After a while, Christopher saw her treating his wound. Despite the severe pain, Christopher tried to flirt with her. However, he was unable to do so because Gwen had tightened the bondage too much, causing him pain. In response to her attempt, Gwen reminded her that she only helped because she felt responsible for his injured condition. Christopher, despite his suffering, thanked her for her help, and soon 205 and Chernish returned to them. 205 held a mysterious pearl in his mouth. When 205 handed the pearl to Christopher, he immediately realized that it was a soul pearl, a powerful essence of an evil spirit. Christopher then made a passing reference to his academic achievements, modestly noting that he had only gotten straight A's. However, Gwen advised him to have 215 eat the soul pearl. Upon hearing this, Christopher could not believe that he would be the one to receive such a rare award. Then the girl explained why the dropped item ended up with him. Hearing this, Christopher allowed 215 to eat the pearl. The dog himself was only too happy to eat the strange round thing. After swallowing it, 205 instantly increased his level from F5 to E3, and the path to evolving into a two-headed creature opened up before him. Christopher was pleased with this result. Soon a spirit pet creation simulator appeared, which presented him with a mysterious chest. Something resembling binary code appeared in front of the hero's face again. He was extremely pleased to receive the reward, and then asked the system to open the chest. When Christopher opened it, there were some useful items inside. Meanwhile, Gwen watched in confusion, her partner looking like a kid who got his favorite candy. She wondered why he was acting so strangely, not knowing that he was the only one who could see the spirit pet creation simulator and the rewards hidden in the treasure box. Puzzled by his actions, Gwen asked what he was thinking. Realizing that only he could see these things, Christopher pretended that nothing out of the ordinary had happened, and stated that he was simply happy that level 205 had increased thanks to the Soul Pearl. Soon they returned safely to the headquarters of the Carefree Mercenaries group. Mateo, quite satisfied that they had successfully completed the task, was ready to give each one their well-deserved reward. However, Gwen, feeling responsible, told her father to give his share to Christopher, since he was the one who made the biggest contribution to the mission and was also wounded. Hearing this, Mateo praised Christopher for his excellent skills and self-sacrifice. Christopher was certainly pleased with the praise, but he did not forget about Gwen's praise, despite her failure. Mateo respected his daughter's decision, and, accepting her request, took out a wad of paper bills. Christopher was shocked to see such a sum. He had no idea that the reward for a 2-star mission would be so impressive. However, his joy quickly faded when Mateo handed him only 1,000 bills. In reality, each of them was supposed to get 500, but because Christopher gave his share, he got the whole amount. It was strange, and Christopher immediately felt that something was wrong. As if he was seeing confusion, if not a scam, he asked Mateo if he was mistaken, since the amount of the commission seemed too small to him. Mateo explained that they needed to leave money for operating expenses, so he took a portion of the overall commission. Christopher, although puzzled, could not hide his disappointment. He openly stated that he was in dire need of money, but deep down he was angry at how much Mateo had taken for himself. Suddenly, Mateo pretended to be calling from a friend, ignoring Christopher's concerns and leaving him completely stunned. The protagonist realized with rage that Mateo had most likely faked the call, using a regular remote control as a telephone. At the same time, each teacher will conduct an initial test to assess the quality of their students' spirit pets. Hearing this, Jason smirked as if he was planning something cunning and insidious. At this time, the teacher reminded those who did not have spirit pets not to worry. Turning her attention to the main character, she said that special equipment was provided for them to test their spiritual talents. Jason took the opportunity to laugh at Christopher and teased him. He stated that he should not participate in the testing at all, since he had neither a spirit pet nor a soul talent, and advised him to refuse to participate. In response, Christopher only smiled, calmly saying that he had recently recovered from the injury that Jay had inflicted on him, and that he was still looking for a new fight with him. Christopher added that since he was confident that he would fail the test, he wanted to make a bet with Jason to see if he could actually pass it. After all the preparations, Elizabeth confidently stood in front of the students, ready to begin the test. The lab technician informed her that the device was ready for testing. Elizabeth then told the students to come forward one by one when their name was called and call upon their spirit pets. The first student, a guy named John, stepped forward and summoned his spirit pet, a black beetle. Elizabeth took a blood sample from the pet and placed it in special equipment for testing. However, nothing happened, meaning that John would be placed in the normal class due to the average quality of his spirit pet. John was clearly upset, as Black Beetle was the best pet his family could afford. Next in line was Jason. As expected, his friends, standing in the background, were cheering for him. Soon Jason opened the green contract gate and summoned a giant green praying mantis. The pet spirit Jason summoned was called Twin Blades Mantis. It was of medium size, with 2.5 stars in height and an E2 level. This fact made Christopher think, because he knew that Jason's pet was an ironback wolf, and he understood how much money this guy had. An idea immediately popped into his head, because Jason could simply change his pet as he pleased. Meanwhile, when the teacher placed the double-blade mantis's blood sample into the special testing equipment, it reacted actively. It soon became clear that Jason's pet was of elite quality. The class immediately announced that Jason would receive an elite-level pet, which automatically meant that he would be placed in the second highest class. His friends standing behind him took the opportunity to celebrate this achievement, showering him with compliments as if he were the greatest of them all. Soon, Christopher confidently confirmed that the bullying had indeed stopped, thereby reassuring her concerns. However, seeing them together, Jason, without hiding his irritation, looked at Sabrina, who was watching Christopher with genuine care and attention. The situation became even more tense when Sabrina, without thinking, pressed her chest against Christopher's arm. At that moment, a look of genuine rage, caused by jealousy, appeared on the local bully's face. Then Jason, unable to contain himself, exclaimed, reminding Christopher of their bet. He hated Christopher, without showing any emotion, calmly repeated that Jason should remember his words well, because if he lost the bet, he would have to submit to his will. In the midst of this tense conversation, Sabrina's name was mentioned. Elizabeth took a sample of her pet, Ho-Ho, and added it to the device. As expected, she received a perfect quality pet, which meant she would be in the top class. Hearing this, she immediately delighted everyone present, and Sabrina herself beamed with happiness. Christopher, not hiding his admiration, was sincerely glad of her success. As the test continued, Elizabeth finally called out Christopher's name, indicating that he was next. Jason took the opportunity to tease him, taunting Christopher to get ready to kneel down and lick his boots. Sabrina, noticing this, wished Christopher luck as he stepped forward, and the hero thanked her with a sweet smile. Since Christopher didn't have a spirit pet, his classmates were immediately surprised, not understanding why he came out first. They thought that maybe he should have taken the soul talent test instead of the pet test. When Christopher continued to move forward, they did not hide their bewilderment, scolding him and even suggesting that he drop out of school. However, their surprise was on the verge of stunned when Christopher opened the contract gate. Jason couldn't believe his eyes. Christopher had made a contract with a spirit pet even though he was sure his spiritual power was damaged. When Christopher opened the contract gate, everyone waited with bated breath to see what would come of it. Sabrina and Jason were the ones who were most looking forward to the result, but for different reasons. And then 205 descended from the gate with a majestic appearance. The small dog looked defiantly at his owner's classmates, showing off his fierce appearance and barking loudly. There was a split second of silence, and everyone realized that Christopher had called the husky. This came as a surprise to everyone, and his classmates, unable to hold back their laughter, began to mock him, making Christopher a laughingstock. Jason, recognizing in this husky the wolf he once killed with his iron back, was stunned. He could not understand how this wolf became the spirit's pet. Then Jason, trying to save face, decided that he needed to somehow react to the current situation. He called out loudly to Christopher and mockingly laughed at his spirit pet. Jason continued to bully Christopher and his spirit pet, causing everyone to laugh and ridicule him. Suddenly, Christopher couldn't stand it any longer and asked him where he was going to broadcast himself if he succeeded in passing the test. His words immediately put Jason in a very awkward position, in response to which he tried to remain calm, assuring that he was a man of his word, but immediately added that he promised to eat if he passed his final exams. Jason was sure that even if Christopher became a spirit master and his pet was a husky, he still would not be able to count on success in the combat ability test. But Christopher was confident that when the right moment came, he would defeat Jason and force him to admit his defeat. When she dropped the blood sample into the special testing equipment, it glowed so brightly that it immediately shocked the two professors standing nearby. The equipment continued to emit a blinding light, leaving all of Christopher's classmates completely confused. Jason and his henchmen couldn't understand what was happening. Elizabeth couldn't believe her eyes as she watched the light in the equipment become even brighter than before. And so, after this tense pause, Elizabeth, without hiding her surprise, announced that Christopher's pet spirit had the ideal quality, which meant that he would be placed in the best class. At that moment, Jason felt a chill run down his spine, realizing just how much trouble he was in. Christopher's test results left all of his classmates feeling as if they had swallowed the very words they had thrown at him earlier. Jason, in particular, broke out in a cold sweat when Christopher reminded him of their bet. Sabrina couldn't help but congratulate Christopher on becoming the leader, which only made Jason feel worse than before. After all the students had completed the first test, Elizabeth officially closed the first round. She reminded everyone to prepare for the second round of trials, which would take place in the Demon Forest. Hearing this, the students were horrified, knowing full well how dangerous this forest was. The Demon Forest was famous for its E and D rank evil spirits. However, Elizabeth reassured them, reminding them that the school would guarantee their safety, but at the same time warned them that it was impossible to predict exactly what they would encounter along the way, and they must be prepared for anything that they might encounter in this dangerous place. Meanwhile, Jason, having learned about the Demon Forest, thought about something. He immediately decided that this was the perfect place to carry out his insidious plan against Christopher. He firmly believed that if he succeeded in carrying out his plan, his problems would be solved once and for all. After the exam, Christopher walked alone, absorbed in thoughts about the upcoming practical exam in the demon spirit forest. Suddenly he heard a familiar voice calling his name. Finding himself face to face with the man, Christopher looked around and realized that it was Martin, a young craftsman from their town. As it turned out, Martin studied at the same academy, and although they were in the same year, they belonged to different classes. Christopher couldn't help but ask why a man as rich and powerful as Martin didn't attend the best schools in town. Martin smiled and casually replied that his family had wonderful connections and access to countless resources. But he was studying here solely because this academy was located closest to his home. Hearing this, Christopher responded with a smile, although deep down he was a little irritated by such a casual manner of showing off. Soon after, Martin asked Christopher about his exam results. The hero, not hiding his pride, said that he had entered the best class, and then asked how Martin had done. Then Martin, beaming with joy, announced with a smile that he had also ended up in the same class, which meant that they would soon be classmates. He invited Christopher to celebrate their success that same day. However, Christopher, although flattered by the invitation, hesitated. He realized that he could not afford the pleasures that Martin could easily receive. So he decided to take Christopher's hand, cheerfully inviting him to join the celebration. He said he would pay their bill himself, and Christopher needed to have some fun sometimes too. A little later they arrived at the majestic building that served as the Imperial Club. Getting out of the car, Martin invited Christopher to look around and go inside. They headed to one of the city's most prestigious clubs, which Martin said most people couldn't get into because it was too inaccessible and expensive. As soon as Martin entered the club, he immediately approached the clerk and asked him to prepare the best room for them. At this point, Jason, noticing them, couldn't understand why this country bumpkin suddenly decided to book himself a better room. Then he decided to approach and address his beloved sworn enemy. To everyone's surprise, he loudly ridiculed Christopher, publicly stating that he definitely could not afford to stay in such an exclusive place. Jason even accused him of somehow sneaking in here. He then stated that if Christopher would kneel before him, he might consider helping him, since they were classmates after all. Hearing Jason speak so rudely of his friend Martin, holding back his irritation, turned to Christopher and asked his name. As expected, Jason introduced himself in a very threatening manner, not forgetting to ask the same question to the young master. At the same time, he did not miss the opportunity to humiliate Martin, calling him a country bumpkin and openly asking for the same room that he himself could not get. Jason reminded them that not everyone got the best rooms at this club, and that he understood perfectly well that Martin could not aspire to such luxury. However, Martin, without losing his composure, calmly asked Jason if he thought that perhaps he himself was not entitled to a better room. Then, turning to the worker, Martin addressed him with a question, asking whether he had the right to enter the best room of the club. The worker happily confirmed that Martin really had the right to do this. And with this, the doors of the entire club were opened to the young master. As if to emphasize his power, he abruptly took off his hat and thanked the girl. Jason was completely confused when he realized that he was in the presence of the city mayor's son. Martin, without hiding his confidence, told him that he was well aware of the power and capabilities of his family. But for him, all these titles and wealth were nothing more than an empty phrase. Martin's answer left Jason speechless, but that wasn't all. Martin then looked at Jason with a cold expression and said that Christopher was his close friend, and therefore Jason should be much more respectful towards him in the future. He warned him that if he did not fulfill his request, he could not blame him for the consequences that would follow. Realizing that he was in a very awkward situation, Jason was speechless, wondering how Christopher had managed to become such a close friend with such an influential person. Not wanting to miss the chance to put an end to this conflict, Martin ordered the employee to add Jason's name to the club's blacklist so that he would never be able to enter the place again. Jason, filled with anger, sharply asked Martin what right he had to do this. He added that the fact that Martin is the son of the Lord of Mercenary City does not give him the right to do whatever he wants in the club. Martin, angered by Jason's rude attitude, made it clear that he was not just a patron of the establishment. He pointed out that, as someone with access to the best room in the club, he had far more authority than Jason. At this point, Jason seemed to finally realize his position in the Emperor's Club. Then Martin, coming closer, finally confirmed that he was the boss of the club, which undoubtedly surprised Christopher greatly. Jason, now completely resigned to the situation, could not find the words to object. He, in a reserved and polite manner, informed Jason that he was no longer welcome at the club and asked him to leave the establishment. With a snap of his fingers, people in black suits immediately appeared and surrounded Jason's group. As he left, the boy remembered the words of his father. who warned him that the boss of the Imperial Club was surrounded by secrecy and asked him to be careful not to provoke him. Meanwhile, Christopher, still reeling from the incident, recalled that Martin was indeed the boss of the club. Martin, in turn, explained that he had merely taken over the management of the club, which his father no longer wanted to manage. At this point, Jason warned Christopher not to relax, hinting that the young master would not be able to protect him forever. As they left the Emperor's Club, he reflected and came to the conclusion that Christopher should not feel safe just because Martin was supported by a prestigious family. On the other hand, Martin, turning to Christopher, advised him not to let Jason spoil his mood and invited him to enjoy the best room of the club. The next day, the students were sent to the gates of the Demon Forest. There they were met by a teacher who immediately informed them about what awaited them in the forest. In particular, he told them about evil spirits hiding among the trees. He also advised students to stay close to the edge of the forest to minimize the risk of danger. The man added that for their safety, the academy hired iron-blood mercenaries who would protect them from the shadows. But he also warned that as soon as the mercenaries began to act, the students would automatically fail the exam. The students, knowing the reputation of the mercenaries, had no doubt that they would be ready to act without hesitation if necessary. Christopher, realizing the importance of the situation, asked Martin if he and Caleb were in the same group. As it turned out, they were indeed from the same group as that large red-haired man. He said that Caleb holds a high rank among the mercenaries. However, Martin assured Christopher that the mercenaries would not dare harm the students. Christopher felt some relief, but still said that he was not going to sit idly by. If anyone from this group wants to harm him, they will greatly regret it. The host, meanwhile, explained to the students what task they had to complete. They had to obtain the inner core of an F-rank evil spirit, although if they were strong enough, they could obtain a higher grade core, E, which was considered an even greater achievement. The exam lasted 3 days, and if students did not return within that time, they would automatically fail. And so, from this moment, their second test began. Christopher, Sabrina, and Martin formed a small group to safely explore the dangerous demon forest. During their walk, Christopher, unable to contain his curiosity, asked Martin if his pet was really a spirit, Kirin. Then he explained that his pet, a snow Kirin named Bellic, was level F9. Christopher, hearing all this, supported him, but at the same time noted that the pet's name was quite ordinary. Martin, of course, disagreed with this approach, arguing that it was the same thing, since Christopher's pet was simply called 205, which didn't sound nearly as bright. So they continued their frivolous argument, teasing each other about the names of their pets. Soon Sabrina brought the rare plant to the attention of Christopher and Martin. It was the flower of the scorching earth, whose roots went deep into the lava underground. Sabrina also revealed that her father told her that this flower could raise Ho-Ho's rank to E. Martin suddenly suggested collecting the entire plant, but was stopped by Christopher, who was just a few centimeters away from him. Christopher explained that the roots of the flower are deeply buried in the lava, and it is impossible to collect it whole. Moreover, trying to pull it out by the roots could lead to the destruction of the plant. According to him, the only correct way is to carefully tear off only the petals. It was immediately obvious that Christopher had an excellent understanding of plants, and Martin, without hiding his admiration, respected his knowledge even more. Sabrina also couldn't help but praise him, appreciating his skill. However, when Martin tried to pick the petals, he was suddenly attacked by an evil spirit. Luckily, Bellic, noticing the danger, quickly created a large ice wall, which blocked the attack in time. Christopher managed to pull Martin aside, preventing him from being hit. The evil spirit known as the Servant of the Scorching Earth turned out to be a fire type with a 3-star growth rating and F9 level special abilities, including explosive cannon and flame blade. As it turned out, the Servant of the Scorching Earth was attracted to this rare flower, and could always be found in the places where this flower grew. Martin didn't wait and unleashed a flame attack on the spirit, but the Servant of the Scorching Earth, as it turned out, easily intercepted his fiery blow. However, the ground beneath his feet was suddenly covered with ice, which was caused by Bellic. After this, Martin ordered him to cast the Frost Earth spell to prevent the spirit from leaving. Martin then asked Bellic to deliver the finishing blow with the freezing osmanthus. The spirit watched as a huge block of ice flew straight at him. However, despite all efforts, the Servant of the Scorching Earth managed to destroy the Frostland and free himself before the freezing osmanthus could enter his body. Christopher then decided to intervene and ordered his pet, 205, to attack the spirit with a fire strike. The attack barely touched the servant's face, but it burned him. Suddenly the spirit screamed in pain, which was evidence of the effective impact. Christopher explained that the most painful effect of the fire strike is that it burns away the spirit's soul. As a result, the Servant of the Scorching Earth was defeated, his body disintegrating into thin air. Sabrina, however, began to worry when she noticed that the petals of the flower of the scorching earth were beginning to wilt. Christopher, thinking, came to the conclusion that the plant itself had suffered from the battle. Without the support of healthy branches and leaves, the flower's energy would begin to leak out. Sabrina wondered what to do in such a situation, because this was an extremely rare specimen. Christopher then suggested using the remaining petals, at which point he crushed the inner core of the servant of the scorching earth and combined it with the plant's petals. Martin was stunned by what was happening, unable to believe his eyes, and Sabrina followed Christopher's instructions, trusting him completely. To clarify the details, Christopher turned to the pet creation simulator to figure out how to create an essence core. Sabrina and Martin, noticing Christopher's unusual abilities, became interested and asked if he was a spiritual pet tutor. But Christopher denied it, but immediately admitted that although he was not a tutor, he understood quite well how it worked. Soon an essence was created for Ho-Ho, far from attractive in appearance, but extremely effective, and Christopher assured that its appearance in no way detracted from its usefulness. Despite her skepticism, Sabrina ordered Ho-Ho to swallow the essence, and the pet agreed with obvious displeasure. At this point, Martin turned to Christopher, informing him that several experts could not figure out what his mutated pet needed to continue to evolve. He asked Christopher for help. The main character, confident that the items necessary for evolution could be found in the forest, agreed to help. However, he gave the command to his pet to rise from the ashes. Ho-Ho soared upward, rushing rapidly into the sky like a comet. As he was about to reach his climax and was about to land back down, Christopher asked Martin to use Frost Barrier to provide protection from the flame spirit's impact upon his landing. Martin was stunned when he saw Ho-Ho begin his transformation, turning into an egg. Christopher explained that this was the beginning of his rebirth. Upon landing on the ground, the egg cracked, causing a massive explosion. Luckily, thanks to the ice barrier, they remained safe and unburned. Christopher was pleased with the result, calling it a great success, while Martin was truly amazed at what had just happened. Christopher explained that Ho-Ho's transformation was part of his evolution into a firefinch or phoenix, a unique fire spirit type divine pet that had a growth rating of 6.5 stars and several amazing skills. With a majestic rise, Ho-Ho rose into the air and landed on Sabrina's shoulder, who, happily thanking Christopher for his help, was completely delighted with what she saw. Christopher, in turn, was happy to help her, and was sincerely pleased with the result. Martin, deeply impressed not only by Ho-Ho's achievements, but also by Christopher's knowledge, decided to ask if he could help Belk evolve as well, since Ho-Ho had already completed his transformation. Christopher, after carefully examining Belk, came to the conclusion that he had every chance of becoming a real Kirin. Martin, again curious, asked if it would be possible to help Belk undergo evolution, and Christopher replied that it would be difficult, but quite possible. He also added that in order for Belk to transform into a Kirin, he would need to be given dragon breath, as Kirins possess dragon blood. However, this turned out to be the biggest problem, as dragons were extremely rare, and despite all their efforts, they could not find one. On the second day of their journey, they decided to head to the Snow Peak Mountains, located in the Demon Spirit Forest. Despite all the difficulties associated with the unbearable cold, the trio did not give up and continued to move forward. In this difficult situation, Martin decided to attract his pet spirit. This did not go unnoticed by the young master, who thanked Christopher for his help, winking at him. Christopher, in turn, repeated that he had already agreed to help and was not going to go back on his word. This made Martin think and wonder why, despite such amazing abilities of the hero, he still remains poor. However, Christopher had no idea what Martin meant. He couldn't make the logical connection between the ability to care for spirit pets and poverty, which greatly shocked both Sabrina and Martin. The young master tried to explain that if Christopher became a spirit feeder, many people would immediately start to turn to him. Moreover, the owners of spirit pets would be willing to pay any amount of money to find an expert who could help improve the level of their pets. Sabrina also added that even the most powerful spirit masters would not dare to insult a spirit trainer, knowing how highly valued this profession is. After listening to their explanations, Christopher finally realized how many opportunities were open to him if he decided to become a spirit trainer. However, at this time he felt that someone was watching them, and this made him feel uneasy. Even though they had been in the Snow Peak Mountain area for a long time, they had not yet encountered any evil spirits, which was very unusual, so Christopher decided to take action. He ordered Ho-Ho to shoot out flames in a certain direction. Then the beast without delay flew to the suspicious place and scorched it with flame. To their surprise, the tree they noticed turned out to be parts of the body of a snow wolf, hidden under a thick layer of snow. Seeing this, the guys froze in surprise. It soon became clear that they were surrounded by a whole pack of snow wolves. Approaching them were beasts that looked like wolves, but branches were sticking out of their bodies, and there were ice crystals on their fur. Their leader stood on a small hill and looked menacingly at the uninvited guests. All of these snow wolves were one-star evil spirits, ranging in level from F1 to F9. Martin, seeing the danger, immediately became worried, because snow wolves are known for their fierce fight with any opponents. Although Christopher had no special fighting skills, he, with his sharp mind, quickly came up with a plan to get out of this situation. First, it was necessary to defeat the leader of the pack. This evil spirit, known as the King of the Snow Wolves, was a mutated species of frost. He had a 2-star rating and E5 level special abilities. Christopher wasted no time and immediately set about implementing his plan. He asked Sabrina and Martin to cover him while he moved towards the Frost Wolf King. While Christopher moved forward, Martin and Bellic held off several snow wolves. With one powerful blow of fire from Pet 205, the soul of the Snow Wolf King was burned away and the spirit itself perished. After this, Christopher ordered 205 to disband the rest of the pack. The pet obediently carried out the command, and the pack, having lost its leadership, immediately lost the desire to fight, retreating and starting to stay away from them. With just one howl, the 205th demonstrated his power, taking on the role of alpha, suppressing evil spirits and spirit pets thanks to his Cerberus bloodline. Since the 205th had just destroyed the Snow Wolf King, it now had dominance over the beasts, which automatically meant victory in the battle. After the Snow Wolf King was defeated, Christopher took his inner core. He explained that in order to help Belk advance to the next level, they needed to find the frost-breaking flower, which made Martin very happy. Soon they reached a mysterious lake, where the next stage of the adventure awaited them. Christopher was extremely puzzled by the fact that the water temperature in the lake was below zero, but at the same time there was no sign of ice in the water. Soon bubbles began to appear in the middle of the lake, and the trio eagerly waited to see what would come out of them. To their surprise, a blue whale appeared right before their eyes. This strange evil spirit was known as the Void Blue Whale of the Kun clan, and belonged to both the water and space types. It had a 3-star rating. Sabrina, unable to contain her curiosity, asked what kind of spirit it was, and Christopher explained that it was a blue void whale, an extremely rare species. Hearing this, Sabrina was shocked by Christopher's deep knowledge. On the other hand, Martin, somewhat wary, asked if this whale was too dangerous. Christopher assured him that despite its sinister nature, it was not a threat, since it was a non-aggressive spirit. However, noticing the presence of people, the blue whale of the void suddenly dove into the water, not wanting to miss the chance to make him his pet. Christopher quickly took off his jacket and, without hesitation, dove into the water, taking 205 with him. Sabrina, worried about his decision, couldn't help but worry about his reckless actions. Apparently, the blue whale of the void swam so fast that Christopher could barely keep up with it. But he did not give up. Going a little deeper, Christopher noticed amazing cold repellent flowers at the bottom of the lake. These rare plants had the ability to repel cold and dissolve frost toxins and energy. Christopher was amazed that he had finally found what they were looking for. Now he began to understand why the water in the lake was cold but did not freeze. However, the boy knew that his main target remained the blue whale of the void. He made every effort to catch up with him, and together with the 205th, trapped him on both sides. The protagonist was impressed by 205's natural hunting instincts, which helped them put the whale in a hopeless situation. Soon Christopher emerged from the water, dragging the blue whale of the void behind him. When Martin asked what he had caught, Christopher replied with a smile that he was making soup from the fish he had caught. He then turned to the blue whale of the void and asked why it was afraid, adding that if the whale did not want to become food, it would be better for it to agree to become his spirit pet. Luckily, the whale immediately agreed, which made Christopher extremely happy. He was pleased with how easily the spirit accepted his offer and became his pet. Soon, a contract was made between Christopher and the blue void whale, and once this process was completed, a spirit animal creation simulator appeared in front of them. Furthermore, when Christopher gave the blue water cube item to the blue whale, its hidden bloodline was activated, and the whale transformed into a mythical creature known as the Vacuum Kun. Similar to what happened with the contract with 205, the Soul Pet Creation Simulator prompted Christopher to choose one general skill for his new pet as soon as possible. After some consideration, Christopher settled on free movement. Although it didn't have any offensive power, its value to space type and support roles was certainly huge. Sabrina, who was watching what was happening, was interested in how the blue whale of the void could float in the air, and Martin, in turn, was completely delighted with its appearance. Christopher's explanation that the whale's ability to fly was linked to its spatial abilities made Martin smile. However, Sabrina, who knew that Kun was a legendary creature that could transform into Pan, expressed sympathy for Christopher, believing that he could become a spirit guide. Meanwhile, Christopher, deciding not to waste time, asked the blue whale to use spatial shift. Soon the whale disappeared and just as suddenly appeared in another place. But when they looked at the lake again, they noticed that it had instantly frozen over. Christopher explained that this happened because he had ordered the void to collect all the cold-breathing flowers in the lake. The flowers were able to keep the water from freezing. And now, without them, the lake simply froze. After hearing about what Christopher had done, Sabrina became concerned that the flowers she had collected had been harmed, as they had been consumed by the blue whale of the void. Christopher, in turn, explained that the flowers were not literally swallowed up in the whale's belly, but were transported to a completely different space. The hero then began to create an essence core for Belk's evolution, and asked Martin to prepare his pet. Martin happily agreed, and soon forced Belk to swallow the essence core, despite his reluctance. However, Christopher assured that it would be good for Belok. As soon as the core was swallowed, a powerful freezing energy burst out of Belok's body, engulfing everything around. Sabrina, worried about such a powerful release of energy, asked Ho-Ho to help them resist the power of frost. In response to her request, a sphere of fire enveloped them, protecting them from the cold. At that moment, Christopher felt a presence next to him. Following this, Stormfly's blow rang out. Fortunately, before it could hit them, Christopher managed to knock the others to the ground along with himself, shielding them from the blow. As it turns out, the attack was carried out by none other than Christopher's sworn enemy, Jason, who teamed up with Caleb and his men to take revenge on the guy. Martin, surprised by such a union, could not help but wonder why these two were together. Jason explained that he was supposed to convince the Iron Blood mercenaries to cooperate with him in killing Christopher. However, it turned out that Caleb also held a grudge against Christopher, and so they decided to team up to get revenge on him. Caleb, after telling Jason about his initial admiration for Christopher, admitted that he considered him quite influential. However, as usual, Martin could not stand aside and stood up for his friend, declaring that he would not allow him to deal with him. Caleb, hearing this, laughed, and told the young master that he would not dare to harm him, but repeated that Christopher was a different matter. Suddenly, Caleb asked Martin if he thought his father would want to fight the Iron Blood mercenaries over some stranger. Hearing all these threats, Christopher turned to his enemies and asked if they really thought they could kill him. Jason then, without losing his self-respect, reminded Christopher that there were 5 people with E-level soul pets on their side, and asked if Christopher could defeat them with only 2 soul pets that could fight. Despite all the difficulties, 3 of them fearlessly continued to stand their ground, not giving the enemy the slightest chance of success. At this time, Caleb, unable to stand any more empty talk, decided to take the first step and began the fight. Christopher wasted no time in giving Sabrina instructions, telling her to keep Fire Monkey and Tusk Boar under control. He himself decided to take care of the Berserker Bear and the Wrestling Kangaroo, instructing the 205th to monitor their actions. Hearing these instructions, Martin firmly told his team to focus on winning and wait for Belka to complete its evolution, promising that they would then win the fight together. He then turned to Christopher and asked who he thought could handle the double-bladed mantis Jason. Losing some confidence, Christopher replied that he would take charge of that moment. Jason couldn't help but taunt Christopher when he noticed that he was attacking without his spirit pet. But Christopher ignored his verbal attacks and focused on executing his plan. He said that whoever decided to kill him would not be strong enough to handle such a task. Suddenly, as expected, a double-bladed mantis pounced on Christopher, but he deftly used his general skill, Spatial Shift, to avoid the devastating blow that would have cut him in half. Seeing Christopher disappear right before his eyes, Jason was stunned by what was happening. However, this was only the beginning. The next moment, Christopher appeared behind him and asked where he was looking. Caught off guard, Jason was easily grabbed by the throat. Christopher wasted no time in attempting to make him a hostage to stop the Iron Blood mercenaries' attack, warning them that he was prepared to break Jason's neck if they did not stop their actions. However, Caleb just laughed and said that Christopher was wrong because they had no business with Jason. He stated that Christopher could kill him as he pleased, but the matter was irrelevant. The hero, without losing his composure, asked Jason if he heard what Caleb said. Then the guy, in despair, begged to spare his life and promised to help deal with the Iron Blood mercenaries. However, Christopher, unable to contain his emotions, reminded Jason how he had once begged for mercy for the 205th, and now found himself in the same situation. A terrible scene from the past flashed through the protagonist's head when his pet was killed by his enemy. Christopher explained that he originally only wanted to teach Jason a lesson, but since he dared to hire people to get rid of him, he had no choice but to kill him first. After this, the hero squeezed Jason's neck hard and killed him. As Caleb watched Christopher kill his classmate without blinking an eye, he realized he had underestimated his opponent. His reaction was instantaneous. The double-blade mantis became enraged at the sight of his master's death and quickly rushed towards Christopher. The hero realized that it was dangerous to fight him now, since such a loss only made him more furious. Luckily, he used his spatial shift again and managed to teleport away at the last moment, avoiding the cut. Caleb, irritated that his ward was unable to catch Christopher, ordered the mantis to kill all of Christopher's companions. Hearing this order, Christopher instantly gave the command to his blue whale. He ordered him to send Sabrina and Martin into the dimensional space before they became targets of the enemies. The next moment they found themselves in a mysterious space from which they could not be reached. Martin, after Christopher, making a quick decision, knew that the enemies would only be able to stay in the dimensional space for half a minute, and he would have time to deal with them before they returned. However, he also realized that Kun's powers, which he had used in the last battle, were beginning to drain due to the excessive use of spatial shift. Then 4 members of the Iron Blood Mercenaries group decided to attack Christopher. However, at that moment, Belka's energy changed so much that Martin felt it immediately. At this moment, Belka's evolution finally completed, and the powerful frost force released by this process filled everything around. The evolved, majestic, and mutated Kirin stood up to his full height, like the embodiment of strength. Watching this transformation, Christopher felt deep satisfaction, glad that all their efforts had not been in vain and the evolution had been completed successfully. Now before their eyes appeared a beast of incredible power. Martin, without wasting a second, immediately gave the order to his pet spirit to kill all enemies. Belek, displaying all his power, simultaneously used spells, easily dealing with the enraged pets of the spirits, while 205 used his power, sending the wrestling kangaroo to the afterlife. Seeing that their enemies were beginning to realize the growing power of their opponents, the Iron Blood Mercenaries attempted to flee. However, they could not escape their fate. At that moment, Christopher, without hesitation, teleported to Caleb along with 205th to prevent them from escaping. Enraged, Christopher bluntly stated that if they wanted to kill him, they should be prepared for the fact that they could die too. Realizing that they were already surrounded, Caleb reminded the hero that they were talking about the infamous Iron Blood Mercenaries, and killing them would cause major problems, as the entire group would target him in response. Then Christopher, looking coldly at Caleb, replied that if the Iron Blood Mercenaries really wanted revenge, then he didn't mind sending them all to hell, along with him. He slammed Caleb's head into a stone wall, causing his immediate death. Meanwhile, Christopher's friends and their spirit pets easily dealt with the rest of the enemies. After this, the hero, approaching Caleb's body, spoke to him with indifference, stating that being the owner of a spirit pet is not as rosy as it might seem at first glance. Meanwhile, Martin and Sabrina felt awkward, because this was their first experience of killing people. Suddenly, Martin began to suspect that Christopher was actually up to something more. Martin realized that Christopher planned to hide the truth about what happened, and blame the Frost Wolves for the deaths of his enemies. Martin could not hide his fear of Christopher, because he, despite the crime he had just committed, remained surprisingly calm. Christopher, on the other hand, had undergone a radical change in his attitude towards the world, and was now ready to crush everything that stood in his way. He was convinced that since the appearance of evil spirits, humanity would no longer be able to return to peaceful times. For him, evil spirits became the main enemies, but not the only ones. He believed that even brothers were capable of killing each other for profit. In such a chaotic world, he believed, being kind to one's enemies meant ultimately seeking one's own death. Later that evening, the three returned to the demon spirit forest, where they prepared food for themselves. Christopher soon appeared and offered them water, informing them that everything had gone well and the mission had been accomplished. He suggested that they train on their last remaining day in the demon forest, to which Martin agreed without hesitation. At this time, Sabrina felt someone's presence nearby. Suddenly, as if from the shadows, a figure appeared. Christopher instantly recognized the girl as Gwen. She fell to her knees, exhausted by thirst. Martin, as expected, after hearing the details, Martin, apparently somewhat confused, began to make guesses. Seeing how Martin was actively thinking, Christopher calmly explained that their relationship was limited to just being roommates. After several unsuccessful attempts to get Gwen to drink water from a bottle, Christopher decided to try to pass the drink to her himself. However, before he could do so, Sabrina appeared with a deathly serious expression on her face and asked what he was trying to do. Christopher, without losing his composure, explained that Gwen was in such a state that she could not drink on her own, and he was simply trying to help her. But Sabrina, as always, could not contain her jealousy and offered to take matters into her own hands. Then Christopher handed her a bottle of water. Sabrina drank from it and carefully poured the liquid into Gwen's mouth. Carefully, step by step, Sabrina fed Gwen, giving her all the water, and then raised her head, but was surprised to notice that Gwen was still not awake. Then Christopher suggested doing a heart massage, and Sabrina, a little confused, asked how it should be done. Then Christopher, ready to perform the procedure, began, but his hands were shaking nervously because he needed to apply a lot of force to press on Gwen's chest. Seeing this, Martin, clearly embarrassed, asked him what he thought he was touching. However, the hero explained that he was simply trying to save her life. He didn't know that Gwen had already regained consciousness, and she mockingly asked Christopher if he enjoyed giving her a massage. Shocked by such a question, Christopher instantly removed his hand from her chest and hastened to explain that he was simply trying to save her. Gwen, however, seemed strange. Her behavior was not the same as usual. She began to remember Christopher's actions, and of course he noticed it. He was sure that Gwen, knowing him, would probably want to take revenge on him for what he had just done to her, but for some unknown reason, she did not show any aggression. On the contrary, she calmly told Christopher to call her big sister. Christopher, stunned, did not know what to answer. Before they could come to their senses, Gwen approached Sabrina and asked if she was the one who had just kissed her. Then Gwen suddenly declared that Sabrina was now one of her people. Then Sabrina, thinking, felt that perhaps Gwen was making fun of her. Christopher knew that Gwen had a cold and calculating nature. This made him seriously wonder if she was suffering from a split personality. He couldn't help but ask her if she really was Gwen, and what exactly happened to her. However, instead of giving a direct answer, she simply sat down at the table and said that all he had to do was continue to treat her like Gwen. As for her wounds, she explained that due to carelessness, while carrying out an E-Class mission, she almost died. After looking into the situation, Christopher decided that the E-Class mission could be a great training opportunity for them. So he offered his help in exchange for equal commission. After some persuasion, Gwen agreed to let him help her with the mission. She said with a smile that if he wanted to die so much, then she had no right to stop him. Hearing this, Sabrina and Martin also did not stand aside and expressed a desire to help. The next morning, after a night's rest, they set off deep into the forest. Their path soon crossed with the evil spirit of the heavenly ancient tree. Martin was shocked to see how this evil spirit turned out to be like an old tree. Christopher explained that the heavenly ancient tree was a plant-type evil with a strength of 4 stars. Its special ability was E8 level vines that could entangle and absorb life force, as well as the ability to regenerate. Christopher knew that defeating the heavenly ancient tree would be extremely difficult. Suddenly, Gwen in her second form opened the contract gate and summoned her evil spirit pet. This evil was the Earthstone Bear. Gwen, without hesitation, ordered her pet to cut down the heavenly ancient tree. Meanwhile, Christopher was shocked to discover that Gwen's spirit pet was none other than Blackie, Swift Thunder's panther. As the heavenly ancient tree spread its vines in preparation to attack the approaching enemies, Christopher immediately warned everyone of the possible attack. Despite this, Earthstone Bear managed to make his way through the wild vines and reach the tree itself. He grabbed one side of the trunk with his left paw and the other with his right, at which point the bear shrew hugged the tree, trying to pull it out by the roots. However, the tree's vines suddenly came to life and squeezed the pet, preventing him from moving further. Gwen, watching the events unfold, told Martin that the heavenly ancient tree was perhaps not as powerful as many of the other evil spirits that inhabited the demon forest, but that it was still extremely difficult to destroy. Soon they all found themselves trapped by the tree's vines. In this dangerous situation, Sabrina did not lose her head and ordered her pet to burn the vines of the evil spirit. Although the vines were partially destroyed by fire, it was not enough to achieve victory. The tree was capable of rapid regeneration, and the vines themselves absorbed life force, which explained their super-fast recovery. Moreover, these vines absorbed his energy. Christopher, realizing the complexity of the situation, realized that they were in a difficult situation, and began to think about the most effective way to defeat the evil spirit. After some thought, Christopher decided that the best way to defeat the heavenly ancient tree would be to use the celestial fire strike. He knew well that it would prove extremely effective against this evil spirit. Once he was confident in the correctness of his plan, he immediately ordered the 205th to use the celestial fire strike to burn the tree. His pet immediately assumed a fighting stance and prepared to attack. This decision bore fruit. The evil spirit was destroyed, and the mission was successfully completed. The boys watched in amazement as such a powerful tree burned. Since it was Christopher who dealt the final blow and killed the heavenly elder tree, Gwen decided to give him the inner source of life that. She explained that it contained a huge amount of life force. Christopher accepted the gift with gratitude, realizing its value. A moment later, Gwen said goodbye to them and left the group. Finally, Christopher reminded her of the 50% assignment. Then, after some discussion, the three of them decided to return to the gate to officially declare the end of the test. When they arrived at the gate, the students who had successfully passed the test were already waiting for them. There was already a teacher there who announced that, based on the testing results, most of the students would be placed in a regular class. Having dealt with them, Elizabeth announced that a special course would be organized for the upper class. Only the top 5 students who advance to the finals will be selected for this special class. Then Elizabeth announced the names of those who deserved to be among the best. These were Sabrina and Martin. Then she said 3 more names: Charles, Chelsea, and Christopher. Looking at Charles and Chelsea, the other students thought they had never heard of them before. As it turned out, they were brother and sister, and both were talented summoners. The most unexpected participant for everyone turned out to be the main character. The guys couldn't understand how this guy, who just recently couldn't sign contracts, was now among the best. After this, Elizabeth asked them to follow her, and a new team of 5 was born. As the corpses of the fallen students and mercenaries from the demon forest were carried out of the gate, the man in the tie summoned his spirit pet and prevented the students from leaving the area. Suddenly he ordered Christopher to be arrested for murder. Elizabeth, worried about what was happening, turned to the professor, whom she called Joe, to ask what exactly was going on. The professor, without hiding his emotions, told her that Christopher had killed his nephew, Jason, and now must pay for his actions with his life. Christopher, without losing his composure, asked Professor Joe what evidence he had to blame him for the murder. Realizing that this man was related to Jason, Christopher realized that there was most likely a personal score between them. Joe, however, stated that he didn't care about the evidence and ordered his spirit pet to end Christopher's life. But Elizabeth did not let him continue. She intervened in the situation, not allowing Professor Joe to carry out his intentions. She made it clear that until he provided convincing evidence of Christopher's guilt, she would not allow him to lay a finger on her student. Professor Joe, doubting Elizabeth's actions, threatened her that he would act against her family if she continued to protect Christopher. But Elizabeth firmly repeated that Christopher is her student, and she will protect him despite the threats. If the professor cannot provide evidence, she will protect Christopher at any cost. Hearing her determination, Joe was speechless, and seeing that Elizabeth would not back down, decided to stop. She calmly told him that if evidence was not provided, they would leave. Soon, losing his composure, the professor realized that his life would be ruined if his family learned that his nephew had died under his jurisdiction. Obviously, he had no evidence and was only trying to find a scapegoat in Christopher. However, thanks to Elizabeth's intervention, Professor Joe now had to work with the mercenary group Ironblood to develop a new plan of action against Christopher. In the evening, after returning, Sabrina, turning to Elizabeth, asked why the academy decided to create a special class for the top 5 students who passed the tests. Elizabeth explained that their talents, as well as the lineage of their spirit pets, were much more impressive than she expected. She stressed that sending them to regular classes would be a waste of time given their potential. However, as time passed, the very thought of staying with the teacher brought him real delight. Seeing his reaction, Elizabeth couldn't help but wonder what was going on in his head, and why sweat was literally dripping from his forehead. At the same time, Christopher was thinking that he would listen to every word this woman said. Feeling extremely awkward, he tried to smooth things over and told Elizabeth that of course he knew he was attractive, and that he was uncomfortable with the way she looked at him. Then he suggested that if she really wanted to spend time with him, they could go to a cafe together. However, at that moment, Elizabeth suddenly hit him on the head, deciding to bring him back to reality. The blow was so strong that a large lump formed on Christopher's head, and he felt not only physical pain from the blow, but also emotional pain from her offensive words. Christopher, not quite understanding what was being discussed, asked if the awakened state was his usual morning state. Hearing this strange remark, Elizabeth instantly materialized a holographic projector screen, which left Christopher in complete shock. With the help of a presentation, she explained what an awakened state is, and images of a man and a pig appeared on the screen. The awakened state meant complete compatibility between the host spirit and its pet. If this state reached 100%, they could unite into one being. After seeing the final result of the merger, Christopher lost all interest in the process, as it turned out to be completely different from what he expected. However, Elizabeth, noticing his reaction, warned him not to look down on the awakened state, as only a few have the ability to unlock this potential. She reminded him of how he had fought Ironside Wolf alone. It made her think that perhaps it was at that moment that he awakened his own state. Christopher couldn't object because he knew that he had only truly discovered this state through the Spirit Pet Creation Simulator. However, he was intrigued when Elizabeth told him that there were other people besides him who possessed powers beyond normal human capabilities. Shortly after, Elizabeth, holding back a little irritation, explained to Christopher the concept of compatibility between him and his spirit pet. Christopher, not having any idea what the term meant, asked where and how this compatibility could be seen. This conversation suddenly gave Elizabeth a headache, and she, slightly losing her patience, asked Christopher to hit her right then and there. Christopher's cells went into a rage at her words, and it took them a moment to realize that she meant something else. Then Elizabeth gave him a death glare, trying to bring him back to reality, telling him to stop talking nonsense. However, Christopher, a little embarrassed but still determined to attack, told Elizabeth to remain vigilant. He warned her that he would only use 50% of his power. But Elizabeth, without the slightest fear, easily stopped his attack, which left Christopher in shock. Before he could even comprehend what had happened, she grabbed his arm and changed his maneuver, causing him to flip upside down. This incident finally convinced Christopher how strong the teacher was. After an awkward fall, he tried to recover, assumed the correct posture, and stood up on his feet. Elizabeth, upon seeing his recovery, told him to use all his powers at 100%, so that she could finally assess how developed the compatibility was between him and his spirit pet. Hearing this, Christopher warned her to be careful. Then he decided to attack and, concentrating all his strength, kicked her. However, Elizabeth, anticipating his actions, prepared to intercept his attack and respond with a fiery strike. When she counterpunched, the blow was so powerful that Christopher felt his heel literally explode from the force of the explosion. However, Elizabeth handled the attack as if nothing had happened, remaining completely unperturbed. Meanwhile, Christopher's boots were burning, and he felt the full force of the fiery blow. Then Elizabeth praised him for a job well done, and to his great surprise, planned to strike again. Unprepared for this, Christopher became afraid of the impending threat and decided to use his shock ability. Suddenly, Elizabeth stopped, and this became a perfect opportunity for Christopher to attack. However, as he was about to strike again, Elizabeth suddenly broke free from his spell. The protagonist was caught off guard by her countermeasure. Realizing that she had easily dealt with his shock ability, Christopher was confused. The next moment, Christopher realized that he had grabbed Elizabeth's chest. Feeling her patience exhausted by his strange behavior, she furiously channeled her anger into one powerful blow to his chest that nearly sent him to the next world. Christopher felt his entire chest hurt from the blow. Lying on the ground and suffering from crushing pain, he decided to stop fighting further. Elizabeth soon approached him with a question about the ability he used against her. She admitted that it caused her to lose consciousness for a moment. Christopher, slightly confused, explained that the ability was called Soul Strike, and it was the skill of his soul pet. After hearing his explanation, the woman realized that Christopher's compatibility with his pet was over 70%, which was quite impressive considering her own compatibility was barely 75%. Elizabeth couldn't help but wonder how he managed to reach such a level, since he had only recently become a spirit master. Christopher responded that perhaps it was because he had lived with 205 for several years before he became his spirit pet. Then the woman, not believing his story, said that everyone has their own secrets, and she would not meddle in other people's affairs. She decided it was better to forget about it and not continue asking questions. After Elizabeth offered to help him master the awakened state, Christopher, slightly puzzled, asked if he needed to pay extra for such a service. Elizabeth, in turn, explained that in his current state, he would not be able to fully unlock the potential of his power, and therefore would not pay for her help. The woman said that she would teach him the use of force, skills, and combat. Upon learning this, Christopher, feeling relieved, happily left the academy. However, a few moments later, when he was already leaving its walls, his attention was drawn to a familiar silhouette. His friend Martin was running quickly towards him, clearly excited about something. As it turned out, he couldn't pass up the chance to find out for himself whether Christopher had received any character development experience from Elizabeth. As their faces came closer, Christopher felt a strange feeling, and jokingly called Martin a fool. Martin, in response, invited him to meet his new classmates. And so, they met Chelsea and Charles, who introduced themselves to Christopher with interest. Martin then suggested that they all have dinner together to get to know each other better. But Christopher politely declined, as he had other plans. He was going to figure out how to register in the city as a spirit guide. Chelsea reacted to these words with obvious shock. She could not believe that Christopher was also a spirit guide. Martin, meanwhile, proudly boasted to the girl and his brother that Christopher had great talent in raising spirits. He even suggested that they ask him how to level up their pets. However, Christopher, with a smile, advised them not to listen to Martin, since he, in fact, only likes to brag. So, Christopher left with a slight smile, leaving his friends in thought. Meanwhile, Chelsea couldn't get rid of her doubts. She didn't understand how Christopher could become such a talented spirit trainer at such a young age. Lost in thought, she remembered that in their city, most of the spirit trainers were mature people. After all, the City Educators Association was responsible for issuing certificates, which were extremely difficult to obtain in their generation. Moreover, most of the adults who came to get the certificate were already adults. However, Christopher, being the youngest applicant for the certificate, had to pass an exam to gain official recognition. This also confirmed that the profession of a spirit trainer was one of the highest paid in their world, and Christopher, of course, wanted this achievement. When Christopher arrived at the registration desk, a smiling, friendly employee asked him which level he wanted to apply for, beginner or intermediate. Deep down, the girl wondered if Christopher had started his training at a very early age, since he looked younger than her. However, Christopher, with genuine interest, asked if there was a test for a higher level, advanced or expert. Hearing his question, the employee informed him that currently the highest level he could reach in this city was intermediate. But if he wanted to reach higher, he needed to register in the Imperial City. Having decided to take the intermediate level test, Christopher, however, faced doubt from a staff member who expressed uncertainty about his ability to pass the exam. She asked him again if he had changed his mind, but Christopher had already paid the registration fee and asked for a registration form. Then he handed the girl the required amount of money. After payment was confirmed, he received all the necessary documents, including the exam schedule. Late in the evening, when Christopher returned home, he heard the shower running, which meant Gwen had returned. At that moment, his mind forgot everything except the thought of whether she would come out of the bathroom without clothes, as she had before. He remained waiting to witness something exciting again. When the bathroom door opened, his gaze focused on the upcoming spectacle. However, his expectations were not met. Gwen came out of the bathroom in a thin dress. Despite his disappointment, Christopher couldn't help but admit that she still attracted attention. Greeting her, Christopher immediately asked her opinion about the last task they worked on together. However, Gwen didn't seem to remember what he was talking about. She then quickly turned her back on him, warning him not to look at her like that, or she would gouge out his eyes. At this point, Christopher was finally convinced that Gwen really did have a split personality. The next day, when Christopher had an exam scheduled, he went to the association building early in the morning. There he was met by the room coordinator, who mistakenly decided that he had come to the wrong place. However, upon learning that Christopher had an examination ticket with him, he allowed him to enter. As soon as the hero entered the room, he was met by a group of adults who seemed to be preparing for an exam. As expected, their first impression was that he had simply entered by mistake, or was joking. But from the reactions of his co-examiners, Christopher realized that this professor was very popular. Soon, the professor quickly greeted everyone and got straight to the point. The task they had to complete was to figure out how to revive a spirit pet that had failed to go through the mutation process. The professor even added that if they managed to help the pet successfully mutate, it will be a big bonus. Apparently he was talking about the pet monkey, who for some reason turned into stone. One of the participants, Bendy, couldn't help but ask the professor why they received a stone statue if their task was to save a mutated pet. The professor in turn responded with slight surprise that if they couldn't even determine what kind of stone it was, then they shouldn't hope to succeed in the exam at all. It is noteworthy that its development was largely unknown, and its evolutionary path was incomplete, and the pet was already in a state close to death. Then Christopher raised his hand and confidently shared his knowledge about it. The head professor, after listening to him, confirmed that he was right, and said that they tried to improve this pet using the core of a stone-type evil spirit, but it failed due to improper handling. The professor informed everyone present that in order to pass the exam, they had to find a way to save this spirit pet within the next hour. Christopher, without wasting any time, immediately explained to the professor what materials and procedures he would need to complete the task. The skeptical professor then asked him how confident he was that his solution would actually work. With obvious confidence, Christopher replied that he was 100% sure that his plan would work, adding that if they could provide all the necessary materials, he would not only be able to save the pet, but also lead it to a successful mutation. Moreover, Christopher said that he was willing to pay for the materials even if they turned out to be useless. Hearing this, the head professor could not help but be surprised by Christopher's confidence. However, after a short pause, he still decided to trust him. The professor ordered his assistant to prepare the necessary materials. Soon, Christopher finished preparing the potion and carefully added all the necessary substances to the liquid. When the solution was ready, he gave orders to place the statue in a huge cauldron, which had been prepared in advance for this purpose. However, one of the examinees who was watching the proceedings could not help but ask if Christopher was afraid that if his spirit pet was killed, he would fail the exam. In response, Christopher turned to the boomers and challenged them if they had any solutions to save the spirit pet. The old people continued to protest, not believing in the possibility of success. However, the professor, who was watching all this, harshly silenced them, after which he allowed Christopher to continue. Once the men calmed down and stopped their violent protests, the hero continued his actions. When the statue was placed in the boiling cauldron, the head professor asked the boy to explain his thoughts and actions. Christopher, without wasting any time, humbly began to explain how the materials he offered would help revive the spirit pet and lead it to successful mutation. He also noted that this process will finally allow the pet to develop further. The professor found these explanations somewhat strange and even funny, but he still could not believe that Christopher would be able to artificially cause a mutation in a pet using the proposed materials. After all, The process of artificial mutation was something incredible. Half an hour passed, but there was no change, which again caused heated discussions among the audience. But as expected, Bendy expressed his dissatisfaction, but one of the exam participants advised Mr. Bendy to be patient and wait for the results, because Christopher probably had something in mind. After this, the hero prepared a small bottle of solution, which, according to him, was supposed to help the spiritual pet evolve. The professor knew that until now, no educator had managed to achieve such success, but he restrained his curiosity, watching Christopher's actions. The protagonist explained that under normal circumstances, this vial would not be enough to activate the spirit pet's bloodline, but the situation was special. Since the pet was on the verge of death, the blood essence contained in the solution will awaken its consciousness and give it the opportunity to develop despite its previous problems. Suddenly, as if by magic, the spirit pet came to life, and at that very second began to behave furiously, which shocked everyone present. The professor, not believing his eyes, was shocked. It seemed as if a miracle had happened before his eyes. The pet was not only revived, but also given the ability to mutate instantly. Soon the pet, having regained his strength, destroyed the materials used to revive him, which caused even greater surprise among those present. Just as Christopher said, the pet had indeed evolved, and it was now a golden gibbon of the monkey god clan that had been activated to 50%. This pet had two types of mutations, the golden type and the combat type, and had a 4-star growth rating of E5 level. The professor then expressed his admiration for Christopher, noting that he truly deserved recognition, although he regretted that he could only give him a certificate of a mid-level spirit educator. Meanwhile, Bendy was clearly irritated by Christopher's success. Suddenly, the spirit pet grabbed Christopher by the leg, which at first scared him a little. But soon he realized that the pet was looking at him with a dazzling and affectionate gaze. When Christopher, a little embarrassed, asked his pet if he wanted to follow him, Gibbon hugged him by the leg and looked at him affectionately in response, as if inviting him to continue their journey together. The head professor, deep in thought, did not know what to do in this situation. Apparently, the spiritual pet wanted to stay with Christopher, but the decision was not easy for the professor, because a lot of money was spent on this pet. Hearing the professor's reaction, the pet suddenly became enraged and began to destroy the floor of the building. In this situation, the professor had no choice but to accept the pet's wishes and agree to his choice. Christopher, expressing his gratitude, told the professor that he could always turn to him for help if needed. In response, the chief professor noted that it was a great honor for the city to have such a young spiritual expert as him. That same day, Christopher entered into a contract with the Golden Gibbon, whom he named King Kong. The pet happily accepted the name, and the contract process was completed using the Spirit Pet Creation Simulator. After the contract was signed, the simulator offered Christopher to choose one of King Kong's skills. Christopher chose the invulnerable Vajra, and the skill was immediately integrated into his abilities, giving him a strong defense. However, now the main character was interested in how many blows he could take. To test its effectiveness, Christopher asked King Kong to attack him starting with 10% of his strength. When he felt he could easily withstand this attack, he asked the pet to increase the strength to 20%. Hearing such a request, the pet was stunned, but still obeyed. Then he asked to use 30% and then 40%. At 50% strength, Christopher was forced to retreat a little. This made him realize how much potential this pet had and what level of power it could withstand. As a token of gratitude for such an invaluable skill that King Kong gave him, Christopher decided to present his pet with his gift, an ancient staff. This object had an amazing property. It could increase or decrease in size, while maintaining an extraordinary weight. After King Kong accepted the gift, he instantly transformed into. As the main character passed by the training hall, he noted that special training had begun at the school. Inside, he saw his classmate with her pet. Sabrina prepared a task for Ho-Ho, in which he had to dodge flying balls that attacked him in the air, while blindfolded. Soon, another spirit pet, Charles, caught his attention. This animal was called the Dragon Conqueror Turtle, and was a representative of the Black Tortoise clan that was activated by 50%. Seeing that Christopher was upset about the difficult training, Elizabeth, deciding to show concern, informed him that he was excused from the task, since his pet was not suitable for this kind of exercise. At this moment, she suddenly turned her attention to Christopher for his lateness. Christopher, a little embarrassed, explained that he had just taken an exam on spiritual education. Hearing this, Martin could not help but ask him if he had passed the exam, to which he confidently answered in the affirmative. This news shocked Elizabeth, and she couldn't contain her joy when she learned that Christopher had already become a mid-level summoner. Meanwhile, Charles and Chelsea, watching what was happening, could not hide their surprise and admiration for Christopher's abilities. However, Elizabeth distracted Christopher and reminded him of their training in the sparring room. When evening came, the hero came to the appointed place, where the teacher was already waiting for him. She asked him to keep their training a secret, as she did not want the school to find out that she was giving him special attention. Christopher agreed without hesitation. Elizabeth then began training him in his fist style, the one-fist strike, a martial art that was used before the new era. She explained that this technique was much more powerful than he could imagine, and could dramatically change the life of anyone who mastered it. When the teacher demonstrated it, there was a real explosion in the hall. Elizabeth said that the hero now has 1/10 of the pet's power, but now he can't use even half of it because he doesn't know how it works. He wondered why no one in his era used this technique. Elizabeth replied that this was because the spirit masters paid much more attention to strengthening their spirit pets than developing their own skills. Ordinary masters don't need to learn such a strike at all. It would be better for them to make their beast stronger. After these words, she showed Christopher how to master this technique correctly. That evening, after training with Elizabeth, the three friends went home together. During this time, Martin tried to gather information about Christopher and Elizabeth. He asked the hero if they had had a secret date. However, as always, he skillfully pretended and avoided unnecessary conversations. To prevent him from continuing his inquiries, Christopher told Martin that he was going to open a child welfare office. As expected, Martin was ready to support him 100%, and even offered to pay all expenses if Christopher became a shareholder. Suddenly they heard someone rushing towards them. They said they also wanted to help with various tasks, and offered their labor in exchange for learning new skills. With Martin's influence and wealth, they quickly found the perfect location for their business, which amazed Christopher. The hero didn't understand how his friend managed to cope so quickly. Martin then suggested a name for their future enterprise. Christopher wanted to call it the Sky Workshop, but Martin thought the name was a bit arrogant, although he approved of it. In the end, they decided to call the studio Heavenly Workshop. Meanwhile, Sabrina, noticing important details in the organization of work, asked if Christopher would like to hire staff, since due to school obligations, they will not be able to run the office full-time. However, Christopher did not agree with this proposal. He planned to sell high-quality goods, and therefore decided to limit the reception of clients only at certain times. At this point, Martin expressed concern about his investment. Then Christopher gave him a short lecture on economics, explaining the principle of supply and demand. As expected, Martin, trusting his friend, agreed with his decision. The next day, balloons appeared in the air, marking the grand opening of the studio. However, it turned out that people showed interest, but did not dare to enter. Martin, noticing this, asked why no one was coming into their establishment. Christopher explained that since their business was new, not everyone trusted their brand yet. However, he was confident that once they had established themselves, things would go much better. Sabrina, confident of success, assured them that new clients would soon appear. At this point, Martin, showing curiosity, asked Sabrina how she suddenly found out about this. Just then, Chelsea greeted the first person who entered their establishment. It turned out to be a young guy, clearly confident in himself. He couldn't help but notice the arrogant name of the establishment. Christopher, without losing his composure, replied that the arrogant title was none of his concern. Quickly assessing the situation, Christopher realized that the guy had not come here to use their services, but rather to start a fight. The guy soon realized that the boss of the studio himself was standing in front of him. But before he could cause any more trouble, Sabrina brought the man to her attention, and it turned out he was her younger brother, Steven, and she invited him here, hoping to attract new clients. However, Steven, being his usual self, pounced on his sister, condemning her for trying to advertise such a small and insignificant shop as theirs. Sabrina, in turn, sharply responded that he should just do as he was told and stop messing around. Martin and Christopher were stunned to learn the strange relationship between the two. Then Steven, with his characteristic impudence, turned to his sister and asked her what she could find attractive in a poor boy like Christopher, and even reminded her that their father would never allow them to be together. Angered by his behavior, Sabrina couldn't take it anymore and hit him on the head, silencing him. After that, she told her brother to leave, but Steven was not going to give up so easily. He asked Christopher what he knew about raising spiritual pets, and Christopher, without losing his composure, replied that, of course, he knew a little. Despite this, Steven continued to interrogate and intimidate him, which was too much for Christopher. Then suddenly the guy said that he would not be able to ask his sister to correct his mistakes if he messed up. However, Martin intervened in the conversation and reminded him that Christopher had already become a mid-level educator. Steven, hearing this, laughed, thinking that Christopher would not dare to tell the truth. But his laughter quickly died down when Martin showed him a certified certificate of intermediate-level teacher. At that moment, Steven froze, speechless, seeing such convincing evidence. Despite the obvious facts, his pride did not allow him to accept the truth. and he continued to insist that the certificate was a fake. Soon Sabrina got fed up with his behavior and told him outright that he was not welcome there and that he could leave without hesitation. However, Stephen was not going to give up so easily, and in order to test Christopher's capabilities, he summoned his spirit pet. Everyone present expected to see a huge and scary creature, but to their surprise, only a small cub appeared. This pet turned out to be an ice tiger cub. It had a 3-star growth type and level F7. Martin couldn't help but laugh when he saw the little pet, while Stephen was clearly disappointed that his pet didn't live up to expectations. However, Christopher, without losing confidence, stated that he could help the pet not only level up, but also evolve. Stephen, looking at the guy with displeasure, asked how confident he was in his words. Christopher, without hesitation, answered that he was 100% sure. After this, Stephen handed over his pet to Christopher. Without losing his composure, he promised that he would apologize and take his words back if it turned out that he was wrong. Christopher, however, agreed to the proposed deal. He asked his brother and sister friends to prepare all the necessary materials to carry out his plan. After 30 minutes, the preparation was complete. Christopher poured a special solution into a bowl and handed it to the tiger cub. Stephen, noticing the strange smell of the liquid, was surprised. He was amazed that his pet, despite this, drank a fairly large amount of the solution. Suddenly the tiger cub froze, which immediately worried Stephen. However, Christopher hastened to reassure him, assuring him that everything that was happening was completely normal. Meanwhile, Charles and Christopher brought several large blocks of ice and began to build a structure around the frozen pet that resembled an igloo. As the ice continued to melt, a sudden gust of cold wind swept through the building. The massive ice structure crumbled before our eyes. Stephen looked with impatience at what had become of his pet. Suddenly, a new evolved species of tiger appeared before everyone. It had a magnificent appearance. This new pet appearance was much more impressive. The pet had a 3-star growth type and was level E2. Stephen couldn't contain his excitement as he watched his pet transform into a stronger and more powerful version. At the same time, Chelsea and Charles, with difficulty believing their eyes, could not understand what they had just witnessed. Martin, meanwhile, returned to Stephen, and then something unexpected happened. He, having changed beyond recognition, suddenly grabbed Christopher's leg. His behavior changed dramatically, and now he happily called Christopher his brother. Martin, condemning his behavior, tried to express his displeasure. But Stephen replied that Christopher was his brother-in-law, and that Martin should know his place in their relationship. Martin said that there was true love between him and Christopher, and Stephen should stop deluding himself. However, Stephen, despite all Martin's words, firmly maintained that he no longer had the right to exist, since now it was he and Christopher who shared a real male friendship. Christopher, deciding not to interfere in their argument, allowed them to continue, but nevertheless he was annoyed that they continued to involve him in this conversation. Soon Stephen, without stopping, turned to Christopher with a request for another favor. It turned out that his father's spiritual pet had been in a serious condition for a long time, and no one could figure out how to help him. Stephen, figuring that since Christopher is so smart, he should know how to handle such a pet. Suddenly he smiled evilly and added that this pet belonged to his future father-in-law, so Christopher would not be able to refuse help. Sabrina, hearing this, couldn't help but ask why she wasn't informed about the pet's situation. Stephen explained that since he had recently entered a special class, their father didn't want her to worry. He smiled at Christopher and said that if he successfully healed his father's spirit pet, he would be grateful to him and would not interfere. However, if Christopher fails, he should stay away from his sister. Meanwhile, all 5 of them gathered around the 6th spiritual pet that belonged to President Samuel. However, unfortunately, none of the invited educators were able to understand what was happening to him. Sabrina and her friends soon joined them. She immediately went to her father and asked what happened to the pet. His name was Howling Moon Silverwolf, and this pet was a lightning and frost type, which might explain the difficult situation. This spirit pet had a 4-star growth type and was level D5. Using a spirit pet creation simulator, Christopher quickly identified the cause of the problem, poisoning caused by a chemical found in chocolate. Then Stephen, with obvious joy, introduced Christopher to his father, explaining that he had known about him for a long time, since Sabrina kept mentioning his name. However, like his son, Samuel immediately expressed doubts about Christopher's abilities. Moreover, he noted that he had already invited a professor to assess the condition of his pet. Upon hearing this, Christopher respectfully addressed the president, reminding him that even the esteemed professor had been unable to provide any help in solving the problem with his pet's condition. These words caused a violent reaction among the spirit summoners present. They began to argue without restraint, arguing that the young man had no right to question the professor's professionalism and competence. However, Christopher confidently assured Samuel that he was able to cure his pet. Stephen was also on his side and tried to convince his father that this guy was an average expert. Despite this, Samuel remained adamant and continued to doubt the boy's capabilities. After Christopher had listened to all these accusations and insults, he informed Stephen that he saw no point in continuing to convince his father of his competence and that it was time for him to leave. At that, everyone greeted the professor warmly, but he immediately noticed Christopher and headed towards him. Professor Donald wasted no time in asking Christopher if he could cure his spirit pet. Samuel thought to himself that the two were talking as if they already knew each other. Christopher confidently replied that he could, but unfortunately Samuel did not allow him to do so. Samuel himself intervened in the conversation, and he learned that Christopher was indeed an expert. As expected, everyone else in the room was stunned to hear this directly from Professor Donald himself. They looked at the young man again, not believing that he could be an expert. The president was shocked by this news, but he was even more shocked by something else. Professor Donald reported that Christopher's level of qualifications far exceeded the qualifications the city could award to a spirit trainer. Sabrina, feeling guilty for her father's behavior, apologized and asked Christopher to stay to heal her father's spirit pet. Even Professor Donald agreed with Sabrina's request. In response, Samuel suddenly changed his attitude completely and began to show exceptional good nature towards Christopher. Meanwhile, the condition of the spirit pet continued to deteriorate, but Professor Donald was still able to establish that the pet had been poisoned. The president, in desperation, begged the professor to save his pet, but he, unfortunately, was unable to determine the exact toxin that had entered Silverwolf's body. Finding himself at an impasse, Samuel asked the professor what to do next. In response, Professor Donald, as if giving up on further attempts, turned to Christopher for advice. He, without doubting his knowledge, confidently stated that he already knew how to cure the pet. He began to explain the chemical nature of the problem, and came to the conclusion that the toxin was called theobromine, a substance that was harmless to humans, but quite dangerous to canines. Sabrina, concerned about the condition of her spirit pet, immediately asked Christopher if the chocolate he ate was the cause of his illness. Christopher confirmed that it was the excessive consumption of chocolate that caused the pet to become ill. He also noted that if it weren't for the spirit animal's incredible strength, it wouldn't have been able to last so long. Christopher stated his point clearly and confidently, and Samuel quickly understood what he was getting at. Then Samuel expressed doubt that someone had poisoned his pet. Christopher confirmed this fact. Even though they had just learned of the poisoning, Professor Donald suggested treating Silverwolf first. Christopher, however, without losing confidence, suggested flushing the pet's stomach and eliminating the source of the poison using an antidote, another poison that neutralizes the current one. The president, doubting the effectiveness of the method, asked him how confident he was in this treatment. Then Christopher, without hesitation, replied that he was 100% sure. Seeing the determination in his words, Samuel decided to trust him and let him try this method. After 30 minutes, the solution was ready. After this, Christopher gave it to his spirit pet. At first, the pet carefully licked the unknown substance. When the pet drank all of the solution, its body reacted violently, and the Howling Moon Silverwolf vomited blood. However, the president, feeling relieved, thanked Christopher for his help and even apologized for his previous behavior. Christopher, in turn, calmly replied that there was no need to worry, because he helped as Sabrina's father, and helping him was his duty. Suddenly, Samuel, clearly inspired, joyfully declared that Christopher was now a member of his family. This made Sabrina blush with embarrassment. Afterwards, the president invited everyone to dinner, and they agreed to participate in this gesture of goodwill. After a while, Christopher thanked Samuel for his hospitality. Before leaving, the hero reminded that the man must keep the return of his spiritual pet a secret until the criminal is caught. Samuel promised him that they would do just that. Later, when they returned, Martin, with obvious concern, asked Christopher if there had been any abuse from Samuel. Suddenly, Stephen burst into the room and angrily told Martin that his father would never have allowed himself to do such a thing to his own brother-in-law. Sabrina, hearing this, immediately scolded him not to say stupid things. Chelsea, noticing that it was time for new customers, drew everyone present's attention to their arrival. Stephen noticed with bewilderment that he did not immediately recognize his father's car. As it turned out, Samuel had brought his wealthy friends with him to advise Christopher on matters related to their spiritual pets. As expected, the friends decided that the man was just fooling around. They said the guy looked no more than 16 years old. However, they were surprised to see that his son and daughter were also with him. Then the president said that one should not judge a person by his appearance. Hearing this, one of his friends decided to test Christopher's abilities. He soon summoned his spirit pet, which turned out to be a huge grizzly bear warrior. This animal, named Warrior Bear, belonged to the Earth and Battle types. It had a 3-star rating and a level of E3. Then the man, interested in the condition of his pet, asked Christopher what he could tell about the health of his spiritual companion. As expected, Christopher had no trouble answering all the questions using the Spirit Pet Creation Simulator. The man, listening to him, was amazed, especially when the protagonist told about the recent behavior of his spiritual pet. Shocked, the man anxiously asked if the boy knew of a way to help his pet. Christopher, confidently and calmly, assured him that the pet was physically absolutely healthy, but the real problem, as it turned out, was not in the body, but in the pet's heart. Hearing these words, the man asked in confusion what exactly Christopher meant. Then the guy explained that the pet no longer felt the same affection, and was now in great sadness, having lost his love. This opened the man's eyes, and he began to wonder how this had happened. Christopher explained that, just like people, spirit pets can also experience emotions, and their feelings can change, just like all living beings. Suddenly the man blushed, remembering his girlfriend who brought a female spirit bear to his house. He remembered the great time the bears had together, and realized that his pet had become the way he was after he and his friend had separated. President Samuel, clearly worried, decided to take action. He asked his friend to call the woman so that she could bring her spirit pet and help solve the problem. Half an hour later, the woman arrived, accompanied by her huge spiritual pet. She entered. As soon as the bears saw each other, they instantly blushed, and one could read in their eyes that a special mutual understanding had immediately arisen between them. As the two bears exchanged sweet gestures and glances, their owners could not hide their amazement. The man, watching what was happening, explained that his pet was especially attached to Hong Hong. He admitted that separation from Hong Hong made him very sad. Then the man, still looking for a solution, asked the woman if she would agree to sell him her pet. But the woman declined with a smile, suggesting instead that they visit Hong Hong if he didn't mind. The man, in turn, hastened to assure her that he would not mind even if she decided to stay with him. It turned out that these two had feelings for each other for a long time. But at first they decided to devote themselves to their careers. But now their destinies were brought together by their own pets. Christopher, using the simulator for creating spiritual pets, was able to help other friends of the president, solving their problems. After that, every day the office was full of clients. They came, even despite the restrictions on time and number of visitors. Huge queues filled the building every now and then. The next day, Martin rushed to Christopher to tell him about his new problem. When he appeared before him, he reported that the suppliers of the goods were refusing to work with him. The main character did not understand why this happened. Martin responded that the Iron Blood mercenaries were threatening violence if they continued to supply. Hearing these words, the hero immediately realized that their leader, Caleb, was behind all this. But he thought that this man had already died a long time ago. Martin, in turn, said that management had now passed to Caleb's brother, Christian. He also added that more than half of the spirit pet training studios in the city were owned by Iron Blood mercenaries, and their influence had taken away a large portion of their customers. But he promised to ask his father to help them out in this situation. But Christopher had a different attitude. He decided to find a more creative way to solve the problem. Determined not to let anyone ruin his success, Christopher told Martin that he would fight them with his wits. That night, the six of them headed straight for the Iron Blood mercenaries' warehouse. Martin, not hiding his curiosity, asked what Christopher's plan was. As it turned out, Christopher had brought some weeds. He then asked Sabrina, using Ho-Ho's help, to set them on fire. Hearing the request, the Fire Phoenix immediately rushed to set the weeds on fire. The wind carried the smoke towards the enemy camp. Smelling the smell of burning weeds, the spirit beasts became enraged, lost control, and began to attack their masters. Meanwhile, Martin asked the hero in surprise how he managed to do it. The hero replied that the only thing that restrained the animal instincts was the contract with the master, and he only helped them get out of control for a while. However, he added that the effect does not last long, so they need to hurry. After this, Christopher and his team began the next stage of the plan. The Iron Blood mercenaries' warehouse was full of treasure chests, which shocked Christopher. He was stunned by the amount of valuables stored there, and decided to take everything. Using Vacuum Kun's magic, Christopher used his spatial magic to take away all the riches. Having stolen everything they could, Christopher and his friends left the warehouse. The main character stated that now they are even with these guys, and the head of the family will kill Christian as soon as he finds out about the theft. Meanwhile, the Iron Blood mercenaries were in complete shock to discover that all the treasures had disappeared, leaving them with nothing. Soon the protagonist headed to the city of mercenaries. He was interested in the question of where Gwen was now, since she never gave him the reward for the plant monster. At that moment, Christopher felt that someone was walking behind him. It seemed to him that someone was pursuing him, but he understood that it was still forbidden to fight here. Soon he reached the place where Mateo was. He greeted the man and wished him good morning, then asked if he knew where Gwen was. The man said he didn't know, and suggested that she had gone on a mission. He himself had a lot of things to do here. He then noted that he had not seen Christopher here for a very long time. The guy thought to himself that if that girl didn't owe him, he would never have come here. because this old man was incredibly unreliable. He didn't even know where his own daughter was. At that moment, Christian's men entered the room, and he ordered them to surround this shabby library and not let anyone escape. He then turned to Christopher and asked if he was the owner of the Heavenly Workshop. The protagonist confirmed that this was indeed the case, and asked the man if he had any problems. Christian said that someone had robbed their warehouse last night, and he asked Christopher if it was him. The protagonist, noting how many people the man had brought, said that apparently he really did suspect him. Christian said that this was indeed the case. He added that if Christopher gave them everything back, then he might even spare him. But otherwise even his young master would not save him. The man also heard that they did not get along with his brother, and asked if his murder was also his doing. Christopher said he knew nothing about their warehouse, and that his brother's death had nothing to do with it. However, Christian stood his ground. He said that he gave him a chance, but he didn't take it, and now he shouldn't cry. After that, he ordered his men to attack and said that he needed this guy alive. At that moment, Mateo stood up from his chair and said that he did not allow them to have a showdown on his territory. Christian was surprised that some old man wanted to help Christopher. At that moment, the old man realized that he too needed to summon his beast. Soon behind him was the Thunder Lion King, who had a 4-star rating. Christopher thought to himself that this old man's pet was almost level C, and decided that you really couldn't judge a book by its cover. Then Mateo looked at his lion, smiled at him, and said that he relied on him. Literally the next moment the eagle fell to the floor, which greatly surprised its owner. Christian couldn't believe that his pet was defeated with just one move. Then Mateo looked at them with disdain and told them to get lost, saying that he did not want to invite them to dinner. The man realized that he couldn't compete with this guy, so he scratched the back of his head, apologized for what he did, and then said that they were leaving now. After that, he glanced at Christopher and said that they would see each other again. Then he picked up his eagle in his arms and ran with all his might towards the exit. When the man left, the protagonist turned to Mateo and said that he had really surprised these guys. In response to this, the old man smiled and said that since he had saved him, he was entitled to payment. Christopher thought to himself that the old man was up to something again, and then said that he had no money. Then the old man came up to him and asked him to relax. Since they were friends and not strangers, he said that he didn't need money. He had one small request. When Christopher heard this request, he was surprised that the old man called it small, since it was an annual competition where all mercenary groups could participate. The man reminded that Christopher was part of the Carefrees and wanted him to represent them. However, Christopher did not understand why Mateo himself would not go there, since he was a very strong fighter. In response to this, the old man said that he was already too old, and now the time had come for the youth. Eventually, the protagonist agreed, as he came to the conclusion that the competition would be a great experience for him. After that, the man mentioned that there were teams of 5 participating there, and this girl Gwen had her own worries, so he couldn't count on her. When Christopher heard about the 5 people, he realized that, as he had suspected, things were not so clean here. He did not understand why Mateo himself could not recruit spiritual masters into the group. Then the old man said that it was no longer his problem, since Christopher had agreed and could not take his words back. Moreover, if he took first place, he would receive the main prize of 1 million. The main character said that he knows where to find people, but he can't promise it. However, he promised to try. In response to this, the old man smiled and said that he had big plans for Christopher, and with such abilities, he would definitely tear everyone apart. Then the guy said that he had one condition: he offered to split the prize in half. In response to this, Mateo started screaming and said that Christopher wanted to rob him. Since he spent 100,000 on the registration fee, and it was very expensive, he said that he agreed to give 100,000 to the main character if he took first place. However, the guy said that in his opinion, this looks unfair, since he is looking for people, working at competitions, and all he gets is only 100,000. Then the old man decided to up the ante and said he was willing to give him 150,000. However, Christopher stood his ground and said that he would only agree to 500,000, and if the old man did not agree, he would make every effort to ensure that in the end he would not receive a penny. When the men came to an agreement, Christopher asked the old man when the competition would begin. In response to this, the man smiled and said that they start tomorrow. Christopher asked him with displeasure why he had suggested this idea to him only a day before the start, to which the old man replied that it was the protagonist's own fault that he had come today. When the competition began, Martin said that although it is optional, most mercenaries rarely refuse to participate, because in addition to the already significant reward, there is an opportunity to advertise themselves. Every year after the battles, the groups undergo classification. The Ironblood mercenaries have been at the top for some time, which is why they are considered the best in the city. After this, Martin apologized to the protagonist, and said that the young master of the city of mercenaries cannot appear in such events, in response to which Christopher replied that everything was fine, and that Stephen would replace him. Hearing this, the boy spoke up and asked the boys not to worry, saying that he would not be a burden to them. He also noted that now in critical situations Christopher turns to him for help, since he is the most precious person in his circle. Then Martin said that there are 322 mercenary communities in total. This time only 305 will fight. A point rating system is used here. Each win brings 1 point, and a loss takes everything away. In the end, all the points earned determine the player's rating. The protagonist realized that the point was that if they beat everyone, then first place would be theirs. Meanwhile, the host said that in the third match they have the hungry wolves and the carefree. Soon, a team of 5 people with spirit beasts entered the area. The viewers knew that despite their low ratings, they were known for their cruelty. They heard that these wolves ate the spirit beasts of their opponents, and if it weren't for the rules prohibiting the killing of masters, they definitely wouldn't have stopped at pets. Opposite them stood the protagonist's team, their faces full of determination. Christopher noted that it appeared that their opponents were deliberately not fed before the competition, and now the feeling of hunger would make them go wild in the ring. Meanwhile, the spectators were discussing their team. One man said that it was a small and unknown team. Unfortunately, they would first encounter the hungry wolves, and it was unlikely that the group of amateurs would be strong enough, so they would have to watch as their pets were killed. At this point, Christopher turned to his team and asked them to listen to what the audience was saying. He said that since their competitor was so cruel, they would not hold back. At that moment, a man with red hair approached them and asked the boys to summon their spirit beasts, since his wolves were already drooling. Without thinking twice, the boys called their animals and decided to show these upstarts what they were capable of. After this, the man directed his wolves straight towards the protagonist and his team and ordered them to devour these animals. Then Christopher turned to 205 and ordered him to deal with these scoundrels. Hearing the command, Cerberus immediately used his skill and rushed straight at the wolves. At one point, the wolves froze in surprise at how intimidating this Cerberus was, while 205 struck out with his claws. After that, the 2 wolves turned their attention to Stephen, who was standing alone. The guy himself was unhappy that Christopher had taken all the fun for himself. However, the guy was guarded by his pet, who immediately bit into the bodies of the wolves that were trying to attack him. After that, he threw them out of the arena and began to roar loudly at them. They grabbed hold of their bodies and tore them apart with their claws. The wolf owners were extremely surprised that their pets were killed so easily. The spectators also did not believe that only half a minute had passed, and the fight was already over, while 3 of the 5 pets did not participate in the battle. After this, Christopher turned to the host and asked him why he was not announcing the result. He suggested that to do this he would need to kill the wolf owners as well. When the presenter warned the main character and said that this was prohibited. Then the main character asked him what he was waiting for in that case. Without thinking twice, the host declared the carefree team the winner of the third match and added 1 point in their favor. Martin was very pleased that their first opponent was completely routed. He assumed that they would easily take first place. However, Stephen said that there were only 5 winners here, and Martin was not one of them. To which the guy reminded him that if it weren't for his status, Stephen wouldn't have had a chance to even get here. Christopher intervened in their conversation and said that Stephen was still a child, so Martin shouldn't have pressed him so hard, since the selection round shouldn't affect them in any way. When they came to an agreement, Christopher suggested that they go to the demon forest to improve their abilities a little. Martin agreed, saying that with a mid-level expert, they would do it in no time. Before they went there, Stephen couldn't help but notice that he was still the most important person in Christopher's life, unlike Martin. After some time, the guys arrived at the demonic forest and met a fire-type volcanic gorilla there. When the protagonist examined its characteristics, he realized that, as he assumed, all the prices and spiritual plants were guarded by evil spirits. Then he turned to Sabrina and ordered her to finish off this monster. She summoned her spirit beast, and together with Cerberus they attacked the gorilla. And suddenly, at that moment, Martin's vacuum beast spat out a juicer for them. Taking it in his hands, Christopher said that the effect could be increased by mixing a level E fire spirit core and a fire spirit fruit. After everything was ready, he raised the plate to Ho-Ho and asked him to drink this freshly squeezed juice. When the bird drank the juice, he immediately began to scream with pleasure. Sabrina noted that her pet now had an E6 level. Christopher noted to himself that this fruit usually raises the pet's level by 2 to 3 units, but in the bird's case it only rose by 1. Apparently, the purer the pet's pedigree, the slower the development. After this, Stephen noticed that Sabrina's pet was now valued higher than all their pets. But Christopher said that he shouldn't be jealous of this. Perhaps they would find something for his pet too. At that moment, the guys suddenly noticed something, and Christopher asked his team to be quieter. A small creature sat in front, digging something in the ground. When Christopher looked closer, he realized it was a money hamster. Martin noted that the animal had an unusual coloring, but it did not look like it was strong. The main character said that this is a money hamster, although he is an evil spirit, but he does not have any attacking skills. He only has the ability to find treasures, and with this hamster, their search will go faster. He then asked Martin and Steven to surround and catch this hamster. Soon all three boys took up positions, and then rushed to the place where the hamster was. But in the end, they just bumped heads with each other. Christopher was surprised that Martin had such a hard head. When the boys looked in the direction of the sound that was coming from somewhere to the side, they realized that the hamster had run away from them and was now watching them with interest from a safe place. Steven was a little unhappy that this hamster was laughing at them, to which the main character said that he would regret starting this game. After that, he summoned his pet and told it to use the silk skill. Martin also summoned his pet and told it to use the icy ground. When the hamster saw all this, horror appeared on his face. Before he could do anything, the skills of the spirit pet struck him. Soon Christopher came close to him and asked him why he wasn't trying to escape now. 10 minutes later, the boys were still wandering through the forest, but now in the company of a hamster. Steven discontentedly suggested that this animal was absolutely useless. However, at that moment the hamster turned towards them and made a loud sound. After that, he pointed somewhere in the direction where, as it turned out, there was a storm plant. Its fruits had a dual nature. The system explained to the protagonist that it contains wind and lightning type energy. Hearing this, the protagonist turned to Chelsea and said that these were storm plants, and due to the dual type of wind and lightning, they would be perfect for her pet. The girl said that she would go and collect these plants, but Christopher stopped her and said that usually such places are guarded by an evil spirit. At that moment, they saw that the silhouette of that very spirit appeared right in front of them. It was the Purple Moon Wolf King, squatting and examining the petals of the plant. Sabrina suggested that they make her go there, since her pet's divine fire would definitely cope with it. Plus, it was the highest level. But Christopher said that they would not participate with her this time. He added that this time Steven, Chelsea, and Charles will fight, and they need to use this opportunity to gain experience. Steven was glad that he was finally given the chance to fight, so he summoned his beast and told it to use Frost Strike. When the evil spirit noticed that ice shards were flying at him, he immediately shattered them with his lightning. After that, he looked angrily at the attackers and growled. Steven was surprised that this guy repelled his attack so easily. Meanwhile, Chelsea entered the battle with her beast and ordered it to use Storm Offensive. The spiritual rabbit struck the wolf with all his might, right on the back of his head. However, the boys soon realized that the evil spirit had an ice shield on the back of his head, so Chelsea ordered the hare to attack him with a furious lunge. Hearing this, the spiritual beast immediately rushed to attack. He jumped at the wolf from the front, but once again crashed into the shield, but this time he managed to break through it. Christopher, who was watching the whole thing, was surprised that Chelsea's physical strength was so great that she broke through this ice shield. After the ice shield disappeared, the wolf lost his ice armor. After that, it was Charles's turn, who told his pet to use the earth shield. With it, he protected Chelsea's pet, who was currently in great danger as the wolf was aiming straight at him. It was no wonder to Christopher why Chelsea's pet was fighting so fiercely, because she had her brother's back, and as long as they worked together, they could easily defeat even such a strong opponent as the Purple Moon Wolf King. After this, Martin ordered his pet to detain their enemy. He used the Frost Osmanthus skill to drop ice blocks on the wolf's head. After this, the pets began to carry out a joint attack on their enemy. When everything was ready, Steven took the core and proudly brought it to the protagonist, who praised them for how well they did. However, he also warned that the probability was not 100%, everything depended on luck. He used the juicer again to mix all the ingredients and make juice for his pet. After that, he acquired a completely new appearance. Now he was no longer a small bunny, but a huge, furious snow hare. When Chelsea saw this, she rushed towards the protagonist and hugged him, thanking him for his help and saying that it was just incredible. When she realized that her hug was making it hard for Christopher to breathe, she let go and apologized for holding him so tightly. After some time, the guys continued their search and soon found a pure azure ice stone, which would allow Steven's pet to raise its level by about 2 units. They then found a stone that contained both the water and rock types, which were most suitable for Charles's pet. After that, they found a century-old iron meteorite for King Kong, as well as a peace flower that contained a spatial type and was perfect for Vacuum Kun. At the end of the journey, Christopher noted that thanks to this little hamster, they were able to improve the strength of all the pets. After some time, they reached a small body of water called the Source. The water in it seemed to be divided into 2 colors, blue and red. In the center there was a small geyser, on top of which there was a flower. The boys didn't understand what it was, but the main character explained to them that it was a very rare flower. He explained that this is a fire-ice flower. It contains two opposing forces, fire and ice. In addition, such a plant can only be found in a fire-ice source, and yin-yang is a top-level material. If you give it to Martin's pet, the effect will be amazing. But what exactly to expect was impossible to predict. Hearing this, Martin said that they needed to think about how to get this flower faster. However, Sabrina asked them not to rush. She said that she would ask her pet Ho-Ho to fly and take the flower from there. When the bird heard this request, it flew to the flower and plucked it. But at that moment, something unexpected happened. Christopher and Sabrina, who were watching the bird, were extremely excited about what was happening. As it turned out, a water snake jumped out of the water and was ready to swallow the bird. But Christopher reacted in time and used a skill called Spatial Pocket. With its help, he protected Ho-Ho, but in the end he himself landed on a hard surface. Eventually he got to his feet and told the boys with a smile that everything was fine. The bird and the plant were safe. However, he thought to himself that using this skill twice had taken a toll on his stamina. Martin looked at this spirit in horror, not understanding who he was. He had two heads of different colors. Christopher said it was a two-headed snake of ice and fire, and its level was D. Afterwards, he asked Sabrina how Ho-Ho was feeling, and if they were in a condition to fight, as her type was great for fighting a snake. However, he quickly realized that the bird was injured, so she would not be able to use her full power anymore. Then the boy realized that this evil spirit would not let them just escape. Then the main character asked all the guys to call on their spiritual beasts and help Ho-Ho, and also to be ready to fight to the death. At this moment, a bird entered the fight and used a skill called Scorching Feathers. However, at this point, the hero realized that their power levels were too different, and asked King Kong to join the battle. However, when the smoke cleared, Christopher realized with horror that things were bad, and King Kong was in danger. As it turned out, the snakes had grabbed him and were now holding him tightly in their grip. The protagonist then summoned Cerberus and told him to use a skill called Shock. Without thinking twice, the dog released hellfire straight towards the evil spirit, but King Kong's fate still remained unknown.